John D. Rockefeller. For those given the privilege of being alive during the Gilded Age of America, the expansion of the American economy was truly astounding to watch. With Cornelius Vanderbilt controlling the monopoly on the waterways and Andrew Carnegie operating the steel monopoly, many wondered if there was another monopoly to be controlled in America. The answer to this came in the form of John D. Rockefeller, oil tycoon and the product of an upbringing that focused on hard work and treating everyone with fairness. Through calculated business transactions and a strategy founded on risk and reward, John D. Rockefeller became America's richest businessman and the first billionaire in the history of America. However, while the wealth of John was enough to warrant a second glance into the life of the industrialist, John found his true love in dispersing the wealth amassed during his lifetime. With John being able to retire at the age of 56, the final 41 years of his life would be spent investing his wealth back into the American culture. With the aid of millionaire friends from the Gilded Age, John created a blueprint of philanthropy that would be followed by future generations and bestow aid on the common man. Through the efforts of John Rockefeller, the first charities and organizations designed to provide scientific research via funding from philanthropists were created. Despite the marring wounds stemming from the allegations of collusion in the early 1900s, John's contributions to America varied from employment to philanthropy, ultimately culminating in his legacy. Through the life of John D. Rockefeller, one can learn that there truly is no greater joy than bestowing wealth to those not as fortunate in the world. John Rockefeller was born into the family of William and Eliza Rockefeller in July of 1839 in the small city of Richard, New York. Growing up, John was the second oldest of his 5 siblings and enjoyed the camaraderie of the close relationship he had with his brothers. While John's mother was a religious Baptist, his father was not as upstanding, referred to locally as the conman or Devil Bill. His reputation with the locals fluctuated between being a freeloader when he was not interested in taking advantage of his friends and a regular con artist when his few friends were unwilling to bail him out of his many debts. During his years of employment, Bill was busy being a lumberman before adopting the trade of a traveling salesman. While Bill tried to work honestly and described himself as a botanic physician, the opportunities to be dishonest as a traveling salesman were too much for Bill to handle, and soon he was selling elixirs with no medicinal value. During John's youth, he rarely saw his father, and during the few times the family was together, John remembers his father even stooping to take advantage of his own family. According to Bill, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." While Bill's cheating was hardly the root of John's future success as a businessman, he did learn how not to act from his father's ways, something he referred to as diplomatic honesty within the corporation. Adding to Bill's reputation as being a con artist, he also left his wife briefly following the birth of his daughter Lucy and had a child with his mistress, Nancy. While Bill would come back and apologize for his infidelity, he would later leave his wife again following the birth of John and father yet another child with Nancy. All throughout this, Eliza, John's mother, continued to try to make some semblance of a home despite her husband's infidelity. Eliza, a faithful supporter of her local Baptist church, raised her children to attend church faithfully. In addition to raising her children in faith, Eliza also taught her children the principles of frugality, while being thrifty. In his biography, John recalls, "From the beginning, I was trained to work, to save, and to give." While growing up, John had always been eager to help his mother, regularly taking extra chores around the house as a help to his mother. To help ease the financial burden imposed on his mother, John made money whenever he could, becoming a regular fixture at the local farmers' market as he sold turkeys. Though the childhood of John was rough and tragic at times, the trials laid the foundation of hard work John would use later as a businessman. With Bill's father regularly having to move from place to place due to his dirty ways, John and his family became accustomed to the rigors of moving almost yearly. While the first couple of moves did not stray far from New York, Bill was soon on the run from the law, and the family was forced to move to Strongsville, Ohio, where John would spend the remainder of his youth. In Ohio, John attended Central High School in Cleveland, simply because the school was free. Following his graduation, John began attending Folsom's Commercial College, where he enrolled in a business class for 10 weeks. While he was without a father for most of his youth, John took the instruction of his mother to heart and preserved an attitude of being inquisitive while remaining obedient. While still in high school, John found that he held a passion for music, a passion that he always thought would lead into a musical career. After John graduated from his 10-week course in business, John was hired as a bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a commission firm located in Cleveland. Despite the many days of working longer than the typical 8-hour day his peers were working, John loved his employment at Hewitt & Tuttle, describing his excitement for all the methods and systems of the office. His mother was delighted to see him so excited about his work, and in addition to loving his work, John was a talented mathematician, a trait that would become invaluable during the later years of his life as a businessman. John's employment paid him 50 cents a day, leading to a salary of $50 for the initial 3 months he was employed at the firm. John held few goals other than working hard and living a long life of 100 years. Additionally, John often stated that his greatest goal in life was to make $100,000 and invest it later. Following 4 years of working at the commission firm, John decided he was prepared to begin his career as a self-employed businessman. So he established a commission business with his partner, Maurice B. Clark. In just the first year of the company's existence, the duo raised over $4,000. 4 years later, the business had gathered over $400,000 in profit. For John, the business marked the first of many successfully capital investments that would only grow from that point on. During this time, John's brother, Frank, was fighting in the Civil War, leaving John to tend to the family and ensure they were taken care of. Additionally, John made contributions to the Union's war efforts and hired the soldiers who were not fighting to help on his farm. John was a staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln and firm in his belief that slavery was wrong. With the Civil War showing no signs of ceasing, John sought to help end the war by donating as much of his profit as he could to the Republican Party. When criticized for his use of money, John replied, "God gave me money and gave me the choice of where to spend it." As a man of religion, John also was quick to point to the maxim of John Wesley, "Gain all you can, save all you can, and give all you can." To aid in the financing of the war, the government of the United States had begun raising the price of oil steadily until it reached upwards of $13.75 a barrel, up from 35 cents a barrel before the war started. With the price of oil skyrocketing, many men sought to make their fortune through oil speculating, a risk that cost many a men their small savings. As the speculators flooded the oil plants, those who were successful were neither ethical nor conservative in their approach, often leaving massive craters in the earth as they attempted to gather the oil. As a result of poor management, the excess oil often flooded into nearby creeks and rivers, leading to a crisis when the potable water sources were polluted with oil. As John watched, the oil industry began to skyrocket, fueled by the war and need for energy sources. Confident that the waste of the oil industry could be avoided, John began to wonder if the oil industry was worth entering. In just a few months, John would enter the industry that would create his untold wealth. John convinced his partner, Maurice, that the oil industry was worth entering shortly after the oil boom of 1863, and soon arrangements were made to sell the Food Commission. As the duo transitioned from food to the oil industry, they began by establishing an oil refinery located in the flats of Cleveland, Ohio. Though the refinery was primarily financed by Andrews, Clark and Company, John and Maurice were only two of numerous men financing the refinery. Also included in the financing were Samuel Andrews, a chemist valuable because he was designing a more efficient method of oil refinement, and two of Maurice's brothers. While oil was quickly becoming the most successful industry in America, the industry was still young, and corruption and unethical practices threatened its future. Many speculated that the industry would not last, but with whale oil becoming too expensive for the average American families, the unethical practices of the oil industry were overlooked in an attempt to generate more wealth. John saw firsthand how the refineries of the day were expelling almost 40% of the product into rivers while keeping the other 60%. As a result, rivers were becoming thick with oil and were almost deemed unnavigable. Putting his frugal principles into practice, John began keeping the remaining 40% after the purification of the oil and selling it as a lubrication agent. Additionally, John powered all his refineries using gas, which cut down on the waste incurred at the plant. To better conserve the remaining 40% of the oil after purification, John began employing scientists and chemists to find other uses for the remaining oil. After only 1 year of this practice, the scientists discovered ways to convert the remaining oil into petroleum jelly, paraffin wax, and tar. Of these three products, the tar proved to be the most successful, with many gas companies requesting tar as a foundation for their roads. To further reduce costs and create more vertical integration, John hired his own plumbers full-time so that the company could lay the pipes for oil without having to hire separate plumbers each time. For John, his success in the oil industry was contingent on one thing: how low he could reduce costs. Fortunately, John would have great success reducing costs, spelling good fortune for his future in the oil industry. As John's costs continued to decrease and his plants continued to grow, John began to wonder how much he could save by creating his own oil barrels. Soon, John was picking out his own lumber for the oil barrels and personally overseeing their production. Upon completion of one shipment, John found that he had reduced the price of a single wooden barrel from $2.50 to 96 cents. As the Civil War drew to a close, the oil industry saw no negative impact from this action, but rather a surge in the demand for oil. For John, the future of the oil industry was critical to his success as a businessman, and in a desperate move to control his own destiny, John bought out the shares of the Clark brothers, making his investment in oil a partnership now valued at $72,500. John's buyout of the Clark brothers has been described as a critical action by historian Daniel Yeagers. Following the buyout of the Clark brothers, John formed the Rockefeller and Andrews firm of oil production. When reflecting on this move later in his career, John referred to the action as the day that determined my career. With the war over and Americans spending more freely, John was poised to take the industrial side of America by storm. John's days of owning the monopoly on oil were but a few moments away. In between entering the oil industry and becoming the oil tycoon that would be his legacy, John became romantically involved with a fellow businessman's daughter. John had long had his eye on Laura Celestia Spellman and decided it was time to begin pursuing a relationship with her in 1863. After a year of courting, the couple was married and would parent 5 children together, 4 daughters and 1 son. The marriage between John and Lucy was a sweet one, with John often doting on his wife and complimenting her intuition. "Her judgment was always better than mine," John once said. "Without her keen advice, I would be a poor man." John and Lucy remained married until her death in 1915. As John prepared to buy out as much of the oil industry as he could, he began borrowing as much money as he could afford while adjusting his capital. With the railroad industry beginning to rapidly expand under the leadership of Cornelius Vanderbilt, John began to see an exponential demand in oil. 1 year after John bought out the Clark brothers, John's brother, William Jr., established a refinery in the suburbs of Cleveland and offered John a chance at entering a possible partnership. John immediately accepted and invited his friend Henry M. Flagler into the corporation, thus establishing the Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler firm. Times couldn't be better for John. His personal oil industry was performing extremely well, and with other oil tycoons worried that John could potentially buy them out, John was being offered partnerships across the oil industry. John was truly the king of the oil industry. As 1868 neared its end, John had instilled his frugal leadership upon the new oil refinery, and was now a partial owner of Cleveland's 2 largest refineries. Coupled with John's various refineries across America, the oil refineries of John Rockefeller were now the largest group in the world. With the Gilded Age dominating the American industrialists, John saw the future of oil as limitless. Cleveland was the largest refining city in the United States outside of Pittsburgh, where Andrew Carnegie was beginning to make a name for himself in the steel industry. With the oil industry booming, it was found that the United States was exceeding the demand of oil by 3 times. In 1870, John decided he was ready to be the sole owner of the oil industry, so he demolished his firm, Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler, and established Standard Oil in Cleveland, Ohio. While it would have been very easy to lay still and simply maintain the success that he had been enjoying of late, John continued to refine his methods of productivity, applying every principle of frugality he had learned as a child. In his own words, "The principles of frugality that I learned as a child laid the foundation for the success Standard Oil saw during my career." With John undercutting the price of any competing oil industry, John made Standard Oil the most profitable corporation in Ohio and the largest supplier of oil and kerosene for the United States. Unbeknownst to John, his competitive pricing in the oil industry was causing a ripple effect to the railroad industry. With oil prices being so low through Standard Oil, the railroads were able to purchase their oil and kerosene at the same prices, shifting the competitive edge from ticket pricing to amenities on the train. To maintain their competitive forces, some of the railroads formed a collusion of sorts and provided discounted freight charges to oil companies that were interested in shipping bulk orders. Standard Oil capitalized on this special deal and began shipping its oil through the South Improvement Company. As the largest client through the South Improvement Company, Standard Oil was given priority on any shipment and in return gave the shipping company stock options for their services. With the incredible discount on shipping, Standard Oil was able to save 50% on their shipping costs. While the discount was considered privileged information and was not disclosed to the public, other oil industrialists soon became suspicious of Standard Oil's low freight options. As freight charges began to increase for other companies, Standard Oil was able to maintain their low shipping costs, causing even more suspicion from rival companies. With the other industrialists demanding answers as to why Standard Oil was shipping their oil for half of the cost of others, protests began to take place outside of Standard Oil's main refinery. Soon the protests turned violent, and Standard Oil was forced to disclose their shipping practices. When the other oil industrialists heard about the collusion, anger and frustration boiled over, and soon a demand for change was issued. As a charge was formed by the leading oil refinery in New York, Charles Pratt and Company, the opposers to the collusion, were soon rewarded for their efforts, and the railroads were forced to reduce the exorbitant discount offered to Standard Oil. Soon the legislature of Pennsylvania backed Charles Pratt and Company, and the charter with which Standard Oil was able to enjoy reduced shipping charges was revoked. Despite the negative ending of the moment of success, John's efforts at reducing costs had led to a reduced price on kerosene and oil for the American people during the short period. Prior to the collusion, only wealthy Americans were able to afford the luxury of oil. With the reduced shipping costs, John had provided a means for Americans to procure more oil than before and at a cheaper cost. As the 1880s progressed, oil would become a staple of the American life, a staple that was delivered by the sacrificial efforts of John Rockefeller. With John in the press for his efforts to lower costs for the American people, Standard Oil continued to see extended success. John continued to practice his most trusted method of diversification, buying oil refineries that were struggling due to their own inefficiency, and then revitalizing the company through implementing his own management and financial practices. Such methods allowed John to experience the financial success of the company, success that had been buried under years of mismanagement or dishonest practices. Despite the hailstorm of media that followed his last attempt at creating a collusion with the South Improvement Company, John continued to attempt secret discounts and undercut his rivalries in the shipping and oil departments. This mass operation culminated in what historians have now nicknamed the Cleveland Conquest, or more commonly known by John's rivals as the Cleveland Massacre. In just the first 4 months of 1872, John successfully organized the buyout of 22 oil refineries in the Cleveland area. Considering Cleveland was home to 26 refineries, the massive buyout crowned John king of the oil industry in the Midwest. The 2 remaining refineries were owned and operated by Charles Pratt and Henry Rogers, the 2 men who had fiercely opposed the initial collusion John held with the South Improvement Company. However, their run against John was soon noted as futile by both men, and they made private arrangements for their respective refineries to be bought out by John. After their buyout, both men became senior partners with John and were highly instrumental in forming the Standard Oil Trust. John recognized the true genius that Pratt and Rogers brought to the table, so he offered both men a position within the Standard Oil Company. Additionally, John made Pratt's son, Charles Millard Pratt, the secretary of the Standard Oil Company. While Pratt and Rogers were 2 of John's greatest rivals, they were not his last. Soon, other rivals would turn into partners under the strategic dealings of John. With John's assets growing each day, persuading a rival to allow John to buy them out simply took the convincing of John's bank receipts. When the rivals saw the tremendous value of John's assets, they were overwhelmed by their value and realized that allowing a buyout was the only way they could generate any profit from their refineries. For any businessman foolish enough to refuse a buyout from John's threat of running their company into bankruptcy and buying their assets as an auction for much less was enough to make them reconsider their rash decision. Despite the appearance that John was trying to destroy his competition and remove all competitors from his life, John maintained that his intent was never to remove all the competition. Pratt, one of John's partners, said, "Competitors we must have. If we absorb them, it surely will bring up another." John referred to himself as the Angel of Mercy for the oil industry, a nickname he maintained by killing the weak competition and reinforcing them into strong assets that created profit. John was growing his company in the industry both vertically and horizontally, causing costs to dip even more. When a new pipeline needed to run from one refinery to another, John established that personally by using his own plumbers who were on full-time duty at the Standard Oil Company. Additionally, John created his own home delivery system that allowed John to deliver the oil directly to some of his customers, establishing a good relationship with the customers while serving them. When John was interested in establishing a new market for his oil, his most common method of penetrating the market was to price the oil below cost to acquire more customers. To better serve his customers, John also hired chemists and scientists to create more uses for the oil than simply a heating or lighting element. At the end of John's run with Standard Oil, the company had found over 300 products that used Standard Oil as its main ingredient. While John had amassed quite a profit through his work in the oil refinery, his true joy came from making a difference in people's lives. At the start of the 1800s, John had achieved two major factors that distinguished him from the other industrialists of his age. Through Standard Oil, John was able to provide almost 90% of the refined oil in the United States, and John finally reached a value over $1 million, becoming America's latest millionaire, a status joined by very few of the industrialists from the Gilded Age. One of John's grandchildren once described his financial genius by saying, "He instinctively realized that orderliness would only proceed from centralized control of large aggregations of plant and capital, with the one aim of an orderly flow of products from the producer to the consumer. That orderly, economic, efficient flow is what we now, many years later, call vertical integration." I do not know whether Mr. Rockefeller ever used the word integration. I only know he conceived the idea. While John was enjoying the success of having very few opponents in the oil industry, his latest fight was waged against the industrialists of the railroad. Primarily Thomas A. Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was feeling threatened by the plan John held for transporting America's oil through pipelines instead of by trains. The second greatest use of the railroads in America had become oil transportation, the defining feature between the rivalry between the railroad and steamship industries. Without the consistent demand for travel the oil industry created, Scott would face financial ruin and could have to downsize significantly. As Scott gained more backing from fellow industrialists in the railroad business, John's threats against the railroad diminished significantly. Also dampening the threat, Scott was able to establish a union of sorts that began buying up some of the refineries not yet purchased by John. Additionally, the group held its own pipeline service. For the time being, John had entered a new road of competition against someone outside of his industry, the railroad. John was not about to let a small fraction of the railroad industrialists dictate his oil practices, so he sought the help of railroads that opposed Scott. After procuring the interest of several other railroad operators, John was able to ignite a price war that undercut the cost of Scott's railroads so heavily that labor strikes began taking place, spelling doom for the railroad if not stopped. Faced with the threat of ruin, Scott and his counterparts sold the oil refineries they had purchased to John. John's greatest adversary was yet to come, however. While the railroads had surrendered their portion of the war, a new entity sought to wage battle with John, the legislator of Pennsylvania. Concerned that John was guilty of unfair trading practices, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania charged John with monopolizing the oil trade in 1879. The charge, though fought by John, was followed by other states, leading to a series of lawsuits against Standard Oil. Through all of this, John continued to purchase the smaller oil companies, despite being under fire for his actions in Pennsylvania. Enduring sleepless nights, followed by days of anxiety in court, John's monopoly on oil had come with a severe price tag. In a memoir written later by John, he recalled, "All the fortune that I have made has not served to compensate me for the anxiety of that period." John had enjoyed a life of fast-paced business transactions, followed by luxury, but was now experiencing the animosity that comes towards those of significant success. John was quickly becoming acquainted with those who hated his success and sought his demise. Unfortunately for them, John was far too big of a target, and his fortune would pay off the lawyers that would continue to bail him out of the trouble and lawsuits that were becoming a presence every day of his life. John's life of no enemies had come to its end. However, the fortune John was enjoying would not see its end and would only continue to grow. Standard Oil was continuing to eat its rivals up with buyouts and was growing to own the trade of oil. At the end of the 1880s, Standard Oil was privy to 90% of the trade market in the oil industry of the United States, far beyond what constituted a monopoly on trade. Such was the same tune in the kerosene industry. Standard Oil had successfully completed a vertical integration system, allowing it to have dominance on every aspect of kerosene production. The wells, trucks, factories, and workers were all controlled by Standard Oil, allowing John to have complete control of the cost from the ground to the customer. Such practice had become common for John and was becoming the trademark of the Rockefeller companies. While Henry Ford established the assembly line, John D. Rockefeller mastered and introduced the world to vertical integration. John actually went as far as to avoid using wholesale resale on his kerosene as well, utilizing a home delivery system straight from his refineries. Over the existence of Standard Oil, the price of kerosene would drop by over 80%, a testament to the vertical integration. With the dropping prices came increased controversy from the competitors of Standard Oil. The lawsuits continued to pile up against the rising company. However, the lawsuits continued to be dismissed. The judges unable to find any unethical or dishonest business practices in Standard Oil. John's practice of undercutting the competition's pricing and establishing private trade agreements continued to drive the company upwards and the competition away. However, soon the competition would take a different route in exposing their discontent with the monopolizing company. With the courts disagreeing with their allegations of violating laws against colluding to make a monopoly, the competition of Standard Oil began taking their complaints to an arguably more powerful entity, the media. Among the greatest media outlets to take up the cross of the competitors was the New York World. In an expose that attempted to rip Standard Steel apart, the New York World labeled Standard Oil as the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. Such a label would have been damaging to any other company, but Standard Oil had developed a trust with its clients, a trust that could not be marred by a mere article outlining allegations of impudence. When asked what he thought about the comments towards his company, John replied, "In a business so large as ours, some things are likely to be done which we cannot approve. We correct them as soon as they come to our knowledge." John's reply was not a confession of guilt, but rather a confirmation to his clientele that he still cared about their interests as much as he cared about the progress of his own company. At this time in the United States, the differing states' legislature lacked unity, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for a corporation to be located in one state and own a factory or refinery in another. With John being the center of attention in both federal and state legislature, John felt it best to not push the boundaries of the law by incorporating in another state. To ease this burden, John began the practice of owning several corporations at once, under different leadership in each state. This lack of centralization seemed unruly, but was pure genius by John and his lawyers. To create some semblance of unity, John's lawyers created a trust that funded the entirety of the various corporations. While the various corporations were independently operated, all the finances were both drawn from and deposited in the same trust, the Standard Oil Trust. To keep with federal regulations, John assigned 9 different trustees to aid him in his management of the trust, which consisted of 41 companies operating across the United States. This trust provided the competition fodder for their latest attacks against John, and the media was not far behind in their own efforts to expose John as a fraudulent miser. Complicating the issue, the few oil companies that were not attacking John, and a few that were, began capitalizing on John's idea and took it further than the legal boundaries allowed. This caused more anger from the public and fueled the fire against Standard Oil. However, the lawyers of Standard Oil continued to succeed as much as the company and the unbeatable nature of the company only grew. Standard Oil had grown to be as big as they come regarding company profit and success. While Standard Oil was becoming the most feared company of the United States, John was growing to be the most revered businessman of his time. Anyone needing proof of his greatness need look no further than the financial records of Standard Oil. Historians now recognize John Rockefeller as being the greatest industrialist of the Gilded Age, simply because he found a resource, revitalized the method with which it was purified, and delivered it to the public, both meeting a need and providing a luxurious life for himself. By the year 1885, Standard Oil had become anything but standard, with over 20,000 oil wells to its name, connected by over 4,000 miles of private pipeline. Little doubt was left in the minds of the world when surmising as to whether Standard Oil was the most successful corporation during the Gilded Age. Additionally, Standard Oil was home to over 5,000 tank cars for transporting the oil and had over 100,000 employees. The only corporation that employed more people was operated by Cornelius Vanderbilt on the Eastern Coast waterways. While Standard Oil had entered the 1880s with almost 90% of the world's soil market, competing oil industries found out how to consolidate their companies and created more oil, rounding out Standard Oil's production to almost 80% of the world's market share. As John watched, his dominance on the oil industry slowly began to shift downward. Notably, the Standard Oil Trust began to decline from its perch atop the oil industry. Once John had dreamt of being the sole provider of oil to the world, a bona fide monopoly on what was becoming the world's most important ingredient of energy. However, with the entirety of the world's oil refineries against Standard Oil, the success Standard Oil had become accustomed to began to decrease. While Standard Oil was still the primary source of oil for the world, customers who could bargain with the other oil companies began using the geographically sound resources for their own oil. Finally, after one final attempt to buy out the remaining oil refineries, John accepted the fact that he would never own the monopoly on oil. In his autobiography written after his retirement from Standard Oil, John recalled, "We realized that public sentiment would be against us if we actually refined all the oil." John recognized that while owning the entirety of the oil industry seemed to be a financially sound decision, he would lose the support of his greatest ally, the customer. As other fields of oil began to be discovered in the late 1880s, John realized that his greatest days of success were behind him. Standard Oil would continue to amass more assets than John could diversify, but the amount of success Standard Oil had once known would never return to the company. Now what was once John's greatest asset in the oil industry had become his greatest enemy: expansion. John Rockefeller was not about to allow the existence of new oil companies threaten his multi-million-dollar asset. For years precluding the competitive boom of the late 1880s, Standard Oil had cultivated a reputation for being a company that did not directly interfere with the prices of their product. John had found that he could alter the price of his oil simply through fluctuating the prices of stored oil when the market fluctuated. With the oil industry rising and Standard Oil decreasing its market size, John established a new form of income designed to increase the value of the company. By issuing certificates that represented the value of the oil stored in the pipelines, John was able to receive more value for his oil, even the value of the oil not yet sold. The certificates were tangible and could be traded amongst the different holders of these certificates. With these certificates, John had created what historians document as the first oil futures market. The market of certificates for the oil created a flurry of activity for Standard Oil, with the certificates dictating the market value of the oil. What was designed to generate more cash flow for a company seeing a reduced market share effectively created one of the first controlling elements of the stock exchange. As other industrialists saw the success John had from the issuing of the oil futures, they too began issuing certificates, allowing stockholders to own facets in multiple companies. With the certificates beginning to grow in value, many of the certificate holders began contemplating the possibility of establishing a location for the certificates to be traded and sold. Seeing this opportunity, John was instrumental in establishing the National Petroleum Exchange in early 1883, allowing the holders a secure location where the certificates could be traded amongst the different industrialists. Once again, John's financial prowess had generated more income for Standard Oil, but more importantly, had created a blueprint that other companies could follow. With the oil market still being controlled by the oil wells in Ohio and Pennsylvania, Russian and Asian oil markets began to seep into the American trade industry, causing the price of oil to drop in the United States while rising worldwide. Among the Americans rushing to the empty yet profitable oil fields of other continents was Robert Noble. Similar to John, Noble had found a new way to refine oil in Russia. That method, coupled with the low prices of the oil fields in Russia, propelled Robert to the top of the foreign oil industry. As John watched, eager to see what would happen to the price of oil in the United States, Noble was able to produce the first oil pipeline, followed by the first oil tanker in Russia. John had not been alarmed by the new oil fields in Russia until he learned that Noble was now being financed by the Parisian Rothschilds, the greatest of the bankers from France. Standard Oil had long been the sole name when outsiders thought of oil, but with the discovery of oil in smaller countries such as Burma and Java, the predominance of Standard Oil was greatly at risk. Adding to the stress John was experiencing during this time, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, transforming the way the world perceived illumination. No longer would kerosene lanterns be demanded in areas seeking light. With electricity being installed in most homes throughout the United States, the kerosene lantern was losing its place atop the chandeliers and being replaced by electric lights that were much cheaper. Faced with a crisis of demand for his product, John refocused his company on expanding their enterprise to meet more than just oil and kerosene. Soon, John had developed a process for producing natural gas, a product rising to the top of demands in the United States. Later, in 1885, the first automobile was invented by Carl Benz. The automobile did more than simplify continental travel for the world. It very well may have saved the industry of Standard Oil. Once thought of as an excess product that was deemed a waste from the refinement of oil, gasoline suddenly became in high demand for those wealthy enough to purchase one of the new automobiles. With Standard Oil still generating most of the world's oil, John was able to create equal amounts of gasoline, yet again expanding the industry and scope of Standard Oil. For John, crisis had been averted, but he was smart enough to know it would show its face again. The only question was, when? John decided his corporation needed a more central location close to the other industrialists. No location was closer than New York City, so John moved the corporate offices of Standard Oil to 26 Broadway in booming New York City. New York City welcomed the mogul, and soon John was regarded in high respect as a citizen of New York, privy to the business transactions of the city. After establishing his residency near the mansions of fellow businessman William Henry Vanderbilt, the eldest son and heir to the wealth of Cornelius Vanderbilt, John began expanding Standard Oil even more. While living among the residents of New York City, John became a magnet for charitable philanthropy, though he turned down most opportunities to give, being more focused on his wealth and work than anything else. However, the calls for aid were also accompanied by an equal number of threats against the well-being of John, his family, and Standard Oil. While John was regarded highly by most citizens, many workers who lost their jobs after a Standard Oil buyout were highly offended by John and considered retribution their only hope at righting the wrong. These threats did little to stop John, and he continued to use the train of New York City for his daily travel downtown to his office. Threats against John and his family were commonplace, but soon John's greatest threat would not be mankind, but rather the federal legislature. New laws were being enacted that would threaten the prosperity of Standard Oil. Congress was beginning their effort to better control the well-being of corporate America, and part of that effort involved establishing the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. This new organization was dedicated to ensuring that all freight was charged equally and no underground deals were going into place, deals that would aid the larger oil industries while lowering the price of oil nationally. While the Interstate Commerce Commission greatly affected the above-ground travel of Standard Oil, most of the oil from the corporation was transported using the private pipelines it had created so many years earlier. Because of this, Standard Oil was able to bypass the restrictions being imposed by the Interstate Commerce Commission. However, a greater cause would soon threaten the well-being of Standard Oil. Congress was also monitoring the financial status of every major industry in the United States, namely the corporations who owned a majority of the market share. To battle the corporations close to creating a monopoly on a certain industry, Congress established the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, an act designed to facilitate more competition between rival industries, thus lowering the price of the product in that industry. The status quo of Standard Oil was progressive, largely the result of years of being the sole firm trusted within an industry. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act was currently flaming its way through the unions of America, with Standard Oil in its sights. After 2 years of successfully evading the state's legislators as they sought to enforce the Sherman antitrust laws, John was finally caught by the legislature of Ohio and forced to remove the Ohio location of Standard Oil from the trust. Helplessly, John watched as corporate Standard Oil was separated from the Ohio Standard Oil. While Standard Oil could heal from this minor wound, the days ahead were filled with more separation so great that eventually Standard Oil would be completely dissolved. The days ahead looked grim for John and Standard Oil, but for the time being, John was interested in expanding yet again. Filled with a Midas touch of sorts, John refused to allow the threats of the Sherman antitrust law affect his enterprise, and soon John was establishing transportation for the steel industry. As John sought penetration into the market of the steel industry, his fight became against neither the government nor the common man. This time, John faced off with fellow industrialist Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had long held the monopoly on steel production, and ironically would face allegations from those seeking to enforce the Sherman antitrust law against him as the allegations against John mounted. The feud between Carnegie and John began to increase and was soon the drawing board for numerous political cartoons each week. John saw that there would be no profit from attempting to penetrate the steel market, so after months of losing money, John refocused on the oil industry, an industry that was beginning to become far more competitive than John had ever experienced. John spent the last part of 1899 buying into as many leases on oil fields as his profit could handle. After securing the leases on oil fields in Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, John began to contemplate something he had never thought of before: retirement. John was growing tired of the daily threats against his well-being, and the vigorous nature of the oil industry began to wear on his health. Having dealt with anxiety for years, John decided the oil industry was finished with his investment of time and hard work. After signing John Dustin Archibald as the new manager of the Standard Oil Trust, John purchased a retirement property in northern New York and settled into his new home on Pocantico Hills. Soon John was busy with the life of a luxurious retiree, going out for daily golfing outings and taking bicycle trips with his fellow businessmen. The life of a daily businessman had finally ceased for John Rockefeller. Following John's retirement from the oil industry, U.S. Steel sought the few assets in steel that John still held onto through his trust. After being presented a deal by Henry Clay Frick, John agreed to turn over his steel assets to U.S. Steel if he was compensated in the form of stock options for U.S. Steel, and was placed on the board of directors of U.S. Steel along with his son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Despite being a completely retired man at only the age of 63, John was still earning millions of dollars each year, earning $58 million in 1902 alone. While John was retired and out of the daily transactions of Standard Oil, his life was still the center of attention for the media and those who continued to hate him. In a particularly harsh exposé composed in 1904, Ida Tarbell authored The History of the Standard Oil Company, a book in which she ignited further hatred against the billion-dollar corporation. Following the book's tremendous success, Ida commented, "I had never an animus against their size and wealth, never objected to their corporate form. I was willing that they should combine and grow as big and wealthy as they could, but only by legitimate means. But they had never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me." Ida's disdain for the Standard Oil Company was fueled in part by her father's unemployment due to the buyouts of Standard Oil Company. John refused to comment on the article further than referring to Ida as Miss Tarbarrel, a name not received well by Ida. While John had built his success on strategic practice, he was now reaping the consequences of hurting the common man through his takeover of the oil industry. Unfortunately, the hurt imposed against the common man would be the least of his worries in the days to come. As John continued to face scrutiny for his business practices, even after his retirement, he thought of a new method in which to expose who he really was to the public. John hoped that through writing he could reach the hearts of the Americans and show his own heart. Unfortunately, the critical attitude of society did not accept the sentiment with which he composed his letters, and the writings were mostly discarded. In one writing, John wrote, "The underlying, essential element of success in business is to follow the established laws of high-class dealing." This statement seemed to directly contradict the method in which he had created such a large fortune through his business. With the letter method falling on dry ground, John decided attempting to correct his poor image with the world was a futile task. Instead, John continued to help his son focus on consolidating the assets into one corporation. Federal law had superseded the state legislature, making it easier for companies operating in multiple states to incorporate into one state. John briefly returned from retirement to act as president during the incorporation, but unfortunately for John, the incorporation caught the eyes of the federal government, and they found the consolidation to have violated the notorious Sherman antitrust law that had taken the other monopolies by storm. At the time of the allegations from the Supreme Court, Standard Oil owned 70% of the refined oil market share, but had decreased their control of the crude oil market until it rested just above 10% of the market share. Regardless of this trivial fact, the Supreme Court continued to move forward with their charges of monopolizing oil against Standard Oil, and stated that the only retribution from this violation was the dissolving of the Standard Oil Trust. As John watched helplessly, his life's work became separated until it rested in 34 new companies that were owned and operated independently. Standard Oil maintained its significance by assigning the word Standard to every one of the new corporations. But to John, the interference by the United States government had cost him his pride and joy. Many of the corporations that were created because of the forced dissolving still last to this day. Among the more prominent survivors are ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Pennzoil, and Amoco. Though John had lost his corporation, the offspring of his mother corporation would survive well past the death of their creator. With the dissolution of the Standard Oil Trust, John was reimbursed for his financial hold on Standard Oil through additional shares in the new separated corporations. When Standard Oil was forced to dissolve, John held almost 25% of the total stock of Standard Oil. While the dissolution of Standard Oil seemed of a negative atmosphere to John, the financial gain of the dissolution was far beyond what any financial analyst could have predicted. In just weeks after the separation, John's worth skyrocketed to almost $900 million, while the worth of all the Standard Oil corporations combined vaulted to 5 times than the original. While John despised not being in control of the centralized company, the added value seemed to lessen the blow, albeit still leading to disappointment for John. In the days following John's official retirement, the millionaire near billionaire began a new life of financing loans for companies that were struggling. The only catch for a John D. Rockefeller loan, the corporation must allow John D. Rockefeller Jr. to come in and apply his managerial prowess to the company to ensure that the company rise from the pit of debt, never to return. Among the companies who allowed such a loan was John Cleveland Osgood from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Osgood was facing bankruptcy if he did not receive a significant loan, and his only hope was the management and financial backing of Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller Jr. began analyzing the financial records, and after appropriating the necessary funds where needed most, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was able to maintain its success and return from the brink of disaster. In return for their efforts at managing the company for Osgood, the Rockefeller duo received the most profitable of the company's subsidiaries, the Colorado and Wyoming Railway Company. Even in his retirement, John could not pull himself away from the thrill of managing finances and making money. Aptly spoken by John, "I do not think that there is any other quality so essential to success of any kind as the quality of perseverance. It overcomes almost everything, even nature." John refused to give up his quality of perseverance, and because of that, his legacy was still taking shape. Though the majority of his worth had been created, John would begin filling in the smaller portions of his fortune, creating a wealth that would soon be returned to the world. John entered the world of philanthropy in a somewhat uncharacteristic method. While John held no reins on the work of the various corporations in which Standard existed around the world, he did hold a vested interest in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company due to his ownership in the Colorado and Wyoming Rail Company. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, or CF&I, was the sole producer of the iron that John's railroad used. In 1913, a violent string of protests erupted on the premises of the iron manufacturers of CF&I, fueled by the United Mine Workers, who were angered that they were not being represented fairly by their unions. The protesters soon transitioned from hostile protests to ones that incorporated violence as their main tactic for change. The result was a massive labor strike that became known as the Strike of 1913. Anyone wishing to intervene in the strike, known as a strikebreaker, was verbally and sometimes physically attacked. Soon both parties, the strikers and the union officials, were arranging for arms and ammunition to be delivered to their respective locations, spelling the doom of a small yet impending war. With a threat against the safety of the innocent bystanders, the National Guard was deployed to keep the situation under control. However, tragedy struck when the National Guard clashed with strikers at a tent city in Ludlow. Most of the strikers' families were living inside of the tents, and after a brief altercation, fire was set to some of the tents, resulting in the death of 15 women and children. The massacre became known as the Ludlow Massacre and brought about high reform within union representation of the mine workers. The massacre cost CF&I a substantial amount of revenue, and the company was forced to shut down their mines. With many of the mine families homeless, John Rockefeller saw an opportunity to invest some of his wealth, this time investing it in the families without homes. After meeting with members of the Colorado legislature, John founded the Rockefeller Foundation, a relief program designated for the families without homes. The Rockefeller Foundation would prove to be highly instrumental in housing the homeless families and would exist well beyond the days of simply making a difference in Colorado. Today, the Rockefeller Foundation is headquartered in New York City and continues to aid families in need. Despite the generosity of John through the foundation, the public opinion soured significantly through the Ludlow Massacre. Convinced that John's greed had once again led to the loss of innocent lives, much of the public in Colorado resented John's lack of interference during the beginning stages of the protest. A dejected John left Colorado to return to New York, his money still going to help the homeless families. The public of Colorado had made their sentiment clear. They were interested in John's wealth, not his genius or business transactions. Though John had begun giving to charity when he was only 16, his charitable contributions had neither met the approval of the public nor registered large enough to be in the public spotlight. However, following the incident with the Ludlow massacre, John began devoting more of his wealth to the efforts of philanthropy. At the bidding of his wife, John became the primary donor for the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary in downtown Atlanta. This seminary was unique because it was designated for African American women. With race relations still on rocky grounds following the Civil War, John's wife saw the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of those hated in America. Considering John was accustomed to being hated himself, the move was well-timed and offered some closure to John as he became loved by the women fortunate enough to attend his university. The college still exists to this day and is now known as the Spelman College. Later, John would further the education of America with a donation of $80 million to William Rainey Harper as the man attempted to resurrect a small Baptist college in Chicago. Today, the University of Chicago has John to thank for its resurgence. While John was becoming dedicated to the needs of American education, he was also sympathetic towards the affairs of his mother's religion, the Baptist faith. During his later years, John would be very instrumental in donating as much money as needed to the efforts of the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society as they attempted to establish Bible colleges in the Philippines and Asia. Due to the philanthropic efforts of John Rockefeller, the Central Filipino University and 3 other Baptist colleges were founded in the Philippines. With John being unable to tend to every request for funding that arrived on his doorstep, he established the General Education Board in 1903 and dedicated the organization to creating more efficient and thorough education throughout all of America. Following the establishment of the General Education Board, John became highly interested in the medical science field and implored where he might be of service financially to the field. One of John's friends, Frederick Gates, was quick to designate areas of the field that were in need of improvement. Due to the efforts of John, the Rockefeller Foundation became one of the first philanthropic organizations that donated money into the medical science field. To further this help, John established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which would later transition into the Rockefeller University. While busy with educational purposes in the United States, John also became concerned with the unhealthy living conditions in South America. Through the efforts of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, the hookworm disease would be completely eradicated from South America. Later, John would create his final philanthropic organization, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Foundation, named in memory of his late wife. Through this organization, John designed funding to the area of social studies. Shortly before his death, the foundation would be merged with the Rockefeller Foundation due to financial inconsistencies in the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Foundation. Historians have made attempts at tallying the amount of money John donated to philanthropy, and by all calculations, John donated over $500 million in his lifetime. Towards the end of his life, John attempted to improve his social image by carrying a pocket full of nickels and dimes with him and passing them out to anyone he saw. Though John entered his retirement as a hated man due to his wealth, he strategically reinvented that wealth into a much greater reward: people. Through the efforts of John Rockefeller, education was transformed in America, and many homeless people were placed into affordable homes. Though delayed by years of business strategy, John's compassionate side finally made an appearance at the end of his life, just in time to be the capstone of his legacy. Through a life of anxiety, John became a victim of depression, suffering from its claws as a 50-year-old all the way until his death. Furthering this depression, John developed a rare condition known as alopecia. Under this disease, John's body rejected all its hair, rendering John a bald man far earlier than his age dictated. To cover up this oddity, John wore wigs wherever he went. John would suffer from severe ailments throughout his working career, but these ailments were significantly reduced when he officially retired from the corporation. On May 23, 1937, John fell short of turning 98 by 2 months and passed away peacefully in his bed at home. In his obituary, the paper wrote, "John D. Rockefeller Sr., who wanted to live until July 9, 1939, when he would have rounded out a century of life, died at 4:05 a.m. here today at the Casements, his winter home, a little more than 2 years and a month from his cherished goal." John was returned home to Cleveland, Ohio, where he was buried in the Lakeview Cemetery, only a few blocks away from where his initial job as a clerk had taken place. Finally, at almost 98 years old, America's most generous philanthropist of the Gilded Age was laid to rest. When one looks at the legacy of John Rockefeller, they might be distracted by the disdain seeping from the public opinion. However, John lived during a time when luxurious lives in America were rare. Philanthropy was still in its infancy, and the demands of the audience, wanting John to surrender and never buy out another company, simply did not align with the logic of success. John played his cards as an American businessman, dedicated to the American dream. His hard work and anxiety were hardly paid back through his fortune, but John still maintained his workload, convinced that building a wealthy bank account required every drop of his hard work and energy. In his last days, John stated, "I believe in the supreme worth of the individual and in his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." John truly embodied these 3 characteristics, and through his example, any businessman in the world can measure his success and compassion with the greatest industrialist of the Gilded Age, John D. Rockefeller. Andrew Carnegie. For those blessed to be born in America, greatness can be achieved through hard work and genius, and all will take a different road to their pinnacle of success. However, the road is significantly steeper for those who were not given the privilege of being born in America. Known to many as the American dream, the promise of success is contingent upon the amount of dedication put forth by the person dreaming of success. The beauty of the American dream is that it applies to anyone willing to work hard in America, not just those born in America. One man who applied the American dream to his success, despite being a foreigner, once was Andrew Carnegie. Born outside of the luxury of America, Andrew refused to allow the hardships of immigration dictate his success. By applying his tireless work ethic and will to succeed in all that he did, Andrew became one of the richest men to grace the United States of America. The life of Andrew Carnegie proves that the American dream is really just the combination of a strong work ethic and strategy that culminates in a life of luxury. While the luxurious life of Andrew Carnegie credits his work ethic as his foundation, his legacy was founded on his tremendous philanthropic efforts. In a day when American literacy was playing second fiddle to the demands of work in the American culture, Andrew Carnegie donated most of his life's wealth to the work of libraries and universities across America and even into Europe. Among his greatest works, the famous Carnegie Hall continues to bear his name and provides a place for musicians of all ages to showcase their talent. Through the life of Andrew Carnegie, one can learn that historical and geographical background hardly dictates success. With hard work and strategic thinking, anyone can succeed in life and make a difference in the world. Andrew Carnegie was born in the small village of Dunfermline, Scotland, to William and Margaret Carnegie on November 25, 1835. Though Andrew was born into a loving home with 2 hard-working parents, his youth was hard. The small cottage Andrew was born in consisted of 1 room that was shared with another family. Inside of this one room, all meals, leisure, and sleeping took place. After Andrew turned 1, his father decided the cottage could not meet the demands of his growing family, so he moved them to a new house on Edgar Street. Andrew's father was employed as a handloom weaver, so most of Andrew's youth was spent moving as his father attempted to meet the needs of his clients. The move to Edgar Street was largely due to a client's request for more damask, a silken fiber. In addition to working as a weaver, Andrew's father was an early advocate for the fair treatment of workmen, often joining protests and marches that carried the cause. When Andrew reached the age of 5, his parents decided he was ready for education. Thus, Andrew began attending the free school in Dunfermline. Perhaps setting the tone for his future years, Andrew's attendance at the free school was due largely to the philanthropic efforts of Adam Rowland. During the years of Andrew's youth, a large part of his influence came from his uncle, George Lauder Sr., an influential political leader in Scotland. George was a heavy reader and introduced Andrew to literature written by Robert Burns. Through Andrew's readings, he became infatuated with the dramatic tales of Scottish heroism found in the stories of Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, and Rob Roy. Andrew's relationship with George stemmed far deeper than merely the ignition of a love for literature. George's son, George Lauder Jr., would one day be Andrew's most trusted confidant and business partner. For the time being, Andrew and George were best friends and playmates. For Andrew, the friendship George offered was an escape from the hardships of his youth, a present help he could depend on. While Andrew was masked from the hardships of his youth, the poverty of his parents became more evident as he grew up. After Andrew turned 13, the trade of a weaver had become so impoverished that it was being largely deserted by its craftsmen. While the weavers were suffering, Scotland was suffering as a whole. Famine and poor financial investment had led the country into fierce starvation that was being felt by everyone. With his father's work limited and the value of the dollar decreasing, Andrew watched as his mother took up extra jobs and odd jobs around the community. In addition to selling baked goods at her pastry shop, Andrew's mother gave her extra time to helping her brother in his shoe shop as a cobbler. With his father's work dwindling day by day, Andrew's mother became the primary source of income in the family, a depreciating experience for his father. Despite futile attempts at correcting the financial ruin his family was experiencing, Andrew's father was facing bankruptcy, so he purchased a stake in the American dream, convinced that emigrating to the United States would offer the only method of renewing his family. After emigrating to the United States, Andrew's family settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1848. Andrew's first impression of America included shock and awe. While Scotland was starving, America was experiencing an industrial explosion, complete with financial success and opportunities for everyone. Andrew's journey to America marked only the second time he had deviated from the confines of Dunfermline. The Carnegie family arrived at their new house in late September of 1848, just in time for the beautiful season of fall in Pennsylvania. Of all the American cities Andrew's father had been able to choose from, Allegheny offered the highest chances of employment. Allegheny was exploding at the time of the Carnegie's arrival. In just 10 years, the residency of Allegheny went from a modest 10,000 people to over 21,000 by the end of the 1840s. For Andrew, the move marked a new life for his family, and, more importantly, the beginning of Andrew's investment, an investment in his future as the leading businessman of America. Allegheny, Pennsylvania, was establishing herself as the industrial capital of America at the time of the Carnegie's arrival. As a key city in a state that bordered the East Coast, Allegheny was a large trade city as well. Factories ranging from wool to cloth cluttered the city, while adding jobs across the state. The trademark of quality in the day, made in Allegheny, became so common and popular that other industrial factories began adding the label to their clothes, even though they were nowhere near Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Andrew's father, however, was uninterested in simply working for a factory. His true love was creating fabric and selling it privately. Unfortunately, the factories of Allegheny were not interested in the fabric Andrew's father was creating, which led to George experiencing the same dismal level of success he had found in Scotland. Additionally, George was finding that selling his product door to door was futile. Faced with no income, George began seeking employment at the factories. Around this time, Andrew was also seeking a job to help alleviate some of the financial strain being placed on his father. Finally, after months of seeking employment, George and Andrew were both given employment opportunities at Anchor Cotton Mills. Perhaps leading to their job offer, the mill was owned by Scottish industrialists sympathetic to George Carnegie's plight. Andrew began his work as a bobbin boy, being paid $1.20 a week. By standards of inflation in 2017, Andrew would have been earning $34 a week. Andrew's first job entailed transferring spools of cotton thread for 12 hours a day and 6 days a week. The days were long and Andrew found little time for play, but the added finances helped his family, so Andrew worked with a willing and cheerful spirit. Sadly, George would soon quit his job and return home. For Andrew, seeing his father fail time after time was difficult, but was also instrumental in ingraining the future millionaire with a hardened work ethic. With Andrew's father once again out of work, Andrew's mother once again became the primary source of income in the household. This time, however, George seemed apathetic towards being unemployed. Andrew began seeking employment with greater pay shortly after, and was fortunate to catch the eye of John Hay, a fellow Scottish industrialist in Allegheny, who manufactured bobbins. Andrew's brazen work ethic greatly impressed Hay, causing him to offer Andrew $2 a week at his factory. The raise to $2 a week would have been equal to a pay of $57 in 2017. When pressed for what his thoughts on his initial employment with Hay were, Andrew recalled soon after this, Mr. John Hay, a fellow Scotch manufacturer of bobbins in Allegheny City, needed a boy and asked whether I would not go into his service. I went and received $2 per week, but at first the work was even more irksome than the factory. I had to run a small steam engine and to fire the boiler in the cellar of the bobbin factory. It was too much for me. I found myself night after night sitting up in bed trying the steam gauges, fearing at one time that the steam was too low and that the workers above would complain that they had not power enough, and at another time that the steam was too high and that the boiler might burst. From this recollection, one can see that Andrew was passionate about his work and coupled his hard work with a genuine compassion for others. Whereas most boys his age were concerned with women or being set apart from the common man, Andrew embraced his life of toil with rolled-up sleeves and attempted to be the hardest worker at his factory. 1 year after his family had begun their residency in Allegheny, Andrew took the advice of his Uncle George and sought employment with the Ohio Telegraph Company. After requesting work with the company, Andrew was assigned to the Pittsburgh office of the Ohio Telegraph Company and was employed as a telegraph messenger boy at the rate of $2.50 a week. With the continued pay raises for his continued employment, Andrew noticed something he called the balance of work. The harder he worked, the higher he got paid. While Andrew recognized that this applied only to manual labor, his calling was found in manual labor, leading him to pledge that he would work as hard as he could. To show his dedication to his job, Andrew began the task of memorizing the faces and names of every businessman in Pittsburgh. Because he would deliver messages to virtually every businessman in Pittsburgh, Andrew saw the memorization as an investment in his future with the Ohio Telegraph Company. Additionally, Andrew began immersing himself in the details of his job, going as far as to memorize the different tones of the incoming telegraph messages so he would know exactly who was messaging at that moment without needing to consult his officers. By the end of his first year of employment with the telegraph company, Andrew could interpret any signal from the telegraph without the aid of his paper slip, making him a very versatile messenger boy. Seeing his dedication to his work, the management at the Pittsburgh office offered Andrew a promotion to telegraph operator, a promotion unheard of for a 14-year-old boy. Since Andrew had to work during the day, he was unable to attend classes at the local school, something he missed greatly, considering his life goals extended further than a telegraph station in Pittsburgh. Andrew's excitement reached a new high when he was informed that local philanthropist Colonel James Anderson had made his 400-volume personal library available to all the working boys of Pittsburgh on Saturday nights after they left work. Andrew had long held a deep passion for reading, so the opportunity to have such a library at his disposal was an early Christmas gift for Andrew. Given his small pittance of money, many would understandably scoff at his opportunity to generate more wealth with just a small amount of money in his bank account. However, Andrew did not see his lack of funds as a limiting restraint on his success. While Andrew may not have been able to use his own money to generate more wealth, he soon found the joy and sometimes stress of using other people's money to generate more income. Andrew became a routine borrower and embraced the life of what he called a self-made man. Andrew recognized that his only source of education would come from his own reading, so Andrew began to immerse himself in books on economics and history. The contribution from Colonel Anderson went much farther than simply providing Andrew with a meager education he otherwise would not have had. The generosity of Colonel Anderson laid the foundation for a promise of philanthropy from Andrew. Andrew pledged that, if wealth ever came to me, I will see to it that other poor boys might receive opportunities similar to those for which we were indebted to the noble man. Through a simple gesture to the common man of Pittsburgh, Colonel Anderson was indirectly responsible for the future philanthropy of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew's employment at the Ohio Telegraph Company led to greater opportunities, and soon other major telegraph companies were offering the young man employment opportunities that paid more than his current job was. One such inquiry that greatly intrigued Andrew was a job with Thomas A. Scott from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. The railroads of America were beginning to take steam and transition into the primary source of transportation in America. With millionaires like Cornelius Vanderbilt jumping onto the railroad bandwagon, more and more financial backing was being given to future railroads, and the need for more employees became imminent. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company was among those experiencing immense success, and the need for more telegraph operators became great. Armed with a new confidence in the railroad industry of America, Andrew accepted the offer from Thomas A. Scott and began working as a secretary and telegraph operator with a pay raise of $4 a week. With the telegraph company being threatened by the emergence of the railroad industry, Andrew saw the railroad industry as having more room for expansion and growth. If there was any doubt or pang of anxiety in Andrew's mind as to whether he had made the right decision, these pangs were extinguished when Thomas Scott offered Andrew the position as superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Andrew immediately accepted, and at the young age of 24 became the superintendent of the Western Division. For Andrew, the promotion was the reward for a work ethic that was rare. For America, the promotion of a relatively unknown 24-year-old marked the first moments of leadership the future of their philanthropy would experience. The days of being a millionaire were not far from the grasp of Andrew Carnegie. Following Andrew's promotion to superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Andrew's first act in his new position was to hire the talents of his younger brother, Tom Carnegie. Though Tom was merely a 16-year-old at the time, Andrew was confident he possessed the skills to be his secretary in addition to assuming Andrew's old job as telegraph operator at the station. Andrew's supervisor was encouraged to see the efficiency with which the duo worked each day. Following Andrew's acquisition of his brother, Andrew brought in another member of the Carnegie family when he hired his cousin, Maria Hogan, as a telegraph operator. Andrew made history by hiring the first female telegraph operator in the country, a fact that set him apart from many of the other superintendents of the day, who thought that railroad operations and telegraph operations were no place for a woman. Andrew, being a man of compassion, saw his employees not as men and women, but as talented operators working hard, regardless of gender. Andrew's promotion to supervisor came with a significant pay raise as well, going from a modest salary of $208 a year to a more luxurious $1,500 a year. By 2017 standards, Andrew's salary would have been around $41,000 with inflation. For a single man living on the railroad's tab, Andrew was beginning his life of wealth, though not evident to those who were around him. Per his friends and family, Andrew utilized the principles of frugality given to him by his parents in their fight against the debt present in the current days of America. Despite not attending college, Andrew was receiving a much greater education than his peers enrolled at prominent universities. Through his career as a superintendent, Andrew was being taught management skills firsthand and was able to see the fruit of his labor directly affect the railroad industry, not just become a correct answer on a test as his peers were evaluated. As America continued to grow as an industrial capital, Andrew recognized that the railroads were becoming America's corporation, aptly dubbed the first big corporation of America by historian David Munt. Additionally, Thomas A. Scott was also more than simply the employer of Andrew Carnegie. Through allowing Andrew release on the financial transactions of the Western Division of his railroad, Thomas began teaching Andrew the principles of investment, knowledge that would someday serve as a building block to the financial prowess of Andrew Carnegie. However, while Andrew was learning valuable financial skills from Scott, he was also becoming privy to questionable trading inside of the Pennsylvania Railroad. As Andrew became more and more aware of what was taking place inside the railroad, his peers inside the railroad began to play on the inexperience of Andrew, convincing him to take part in their insider trading. Among those most involved, Pennsylvania Railroad's president, John Edgar Thompson, constructed somewhat of a favor system in which companies closely connected with the railroad would purchase stock in the railroad, driving up the cost of stock for the railroad. Ironically, this insider trading would be the cornerstone for most of the wealth Andrew Carnegie would begin his life as a millionaire with. At the height of Andrew's insider trading, Thomas A. Scott gave him the opportunity to invest a small sum of $500 in the Adams Express. The investment came strongly encouraged due to the information Scott had directly received from the Adams Express. To gather the necessary cash for the investment, Andrew convinced his mother to mortgage the family house for $600, though the house was worth more than $700. The investment would pay off, and his mother's money would be restored years following the investment. As Andrew's reward for his investment, Scott presented him with numerous shares of the Theodore Tuttle Woodruff's Company, the leading sleeper car producer of the day. As Andrew continued investing in Woodruff's sleeper car company, Andrew began to develop capital that he could invest in additional companies. As part of his campaign to diversify his investments, Andrew began investing in industries that surrounded the railroad industry, investments in iron companies, construction companies that built bridges, and rail factories began to dominate the numerous investments of Andrew. While the majority of Andrew's relationship with Scott fed him leadership principles and management skills, Andrew would value his relationship with Scott even more as his career progressed. Someday, Scott would need iron rails from Andrew, a need that required a good relationship with the iron companies of the day. Additionally, both John Thompson and Thomas Scott would be the first men offered a stake in Andrew's company. The year was 1861. America had entered a war that centered her sights on her fellow brothers. The North and the South were engaged in a fierce war that threatened to divide the nation before it would mend wrongs and hearts. 1 year prior to the Civil War, Andrew began using his business genius as he arranged mergers between companies that were struggling. Utilizing his good relationship with Theodore Woodruff, Andrew organized a merger that combined the largest producer of sleeper cars, Thomas Woodruff, with the inventor of the sleeper car, George Pullman. Pullman had recently invented a luxurious sleeper car that was designed for those purchasing the step above basic travel, first class. The luxurious sleeper car allowed prominent businessmen the opportunity to maintain their gaudy lifestyles even aboard the railroad as they traveled upwards of 500 miles across the United States. As Andrew continued his employment with the Pennsylvania Railroad as superintendent of the Western Division, the merger between Woodruff and Pullman proved to be a successful investment for Andrew. However, as 1860 turned to 1861, Andrew watched as America became a divided nation. Of particular interest to Andrew, his old supervisor, Thomas Scott, was now the Assistant Secretary of War. As Assistant Secretary of War, Scott was tasked with moving various amounts of Union troops across America to different batteries. Thomas Scott worked extensively with Cornelius Vanderbilt, as Vanderbilt largely controlled the waterways. However, needing a right-hand man for his land transportation, Scott hired Andrew as his superintendent of the military railways and telegraph operations for the Union. One of Andrew's first tasks as supervisor was to reopen the rail lines that had been cut by the rebels of the South. To better lead his young group of militants working to keep the railroads clear, Andrew rode with the first battery of troops he delivered to Washington, D.C. Additionally, Andrew took special care as he rode with every transport that was moving captured Southern forces between holding locations. Andrew's last such operation would come after the Southern forces were defeated at Bull Run. Without Andrew, the Civil War might have ended much differently. Under his careful supervision, the telegraph operations between batteries went unrestricted and were kept operational for the entirety of the war. During the first days of the war, a telegraph wire had become tangled, leading Andrew to work at freeing it. After much pulling, the wire came free but grazed his cheek, leaving a cut that resulted in a visible scar. When retelling that story later, Andrew would always jokingly refer to that instance as the first casualty of the war. With the Civil War over, life in America turned to restoration and returned to the normal circumstances it had known prior to the war. While the Civil War devastated families and destroyed property, it did leave America with one revelation: the revelation that the industrialization of America had played the greatest role in establishing the success and dominance the Union felt. With the factories of the East Coast at its disposal, the Union was given more freedom and supplies. The South's defeat was due in large part to the lack of supplies. While manpower existed, the supplies simply ran out, forcing the surrender. Andrew was hardly the first to notice this, but he was one of the few who acted upon it. During the war, Andrew began investing in the Story Farm, located on the profitable Oil Creek in Pennsylvania. With the farm residing in the countryside of Venango County, Story Farm was seeing success like none other in the oil industry. Andrew invested a substantial $40,000 in the farm, expecting modest results. However, the farm began to grow, rewarding Andrew luxuriously for his investment. In just 1 year, Story Farm issued over $1 million in cash dividends as the demand for petroleum oil began to skyrocket. With the wells selling in no time, the farm became the center of the oil industry. Oil was integral in the production of any iron products, and such products were integral to the success of the Union in the war. With cannonballs, cannons, ammunition, and gunboat armor demanding the highest grade of iron, the petroleum industry became almost as important to the war's end as the railroad industry was to America. With Pittsburgh sporting more industrial factories than any other large city, the war truly began to revolve around the production of Pittsburgh. Andrew noticed the demand being created for metal, so he led fellow citizens of Pittsburgh in the creation of a steel rolling mill. While this move was made in response to a wartime demand, the fortune amassed from this factory would breed the future of his fortune, and is largely recognized as the source of the fortune Andrew would later enjoy. Andrew was truly becoming the king of Pittsburgh. With the war over, Andrew began diverting his energies away from the railroads and more on the growing ironworks industry. Andrew was becoming famous for deserting a seemingly prosperous industry for one that was doing better, and his transition from the railroads to ironworks was no exception. Among his first investments in the ironworks, Andrew helped found the Keystone Bridge Works, along with the Union Iron Works, both located in Pittsburgh. While Andrew no longer worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, he worked hard to maintain his relationship with Thomas A. Scott and John Thompson, two relationships that would become his greatest allies in the ironworks as he provided them with railroad supplies. In the early days of his transition to ironworks, Andrew sought the help of Thomas Scott again as he pursued contracts for his most profitable company, Keystone Bridge Company. As rewards for their help in accruing new contracts for his iron works, Andrew gave Scott and Thompson stock options in the Keystone Bridge Company. The stock, though brand new, was already worth hundreds. As the relationship between the trio began to grow, Pennsylvania Railroad Company would reward Andrew equally for his camaraderie by becoming his longest-lasting and highest-paying company. While Andrew was growing his connection with the city of Pittsburgh, he began to become a social figure and one that was invited to many illustrious events. While at these events, Andrew was careful to develop relationships that included potential business. A flattering man who possessed charm and wit, Andrew was often the center of attention at such gatherings and was the envy of many Pittsburgh businessmen. However, while Andrew was a businessman and enjoyed few things more than making money, he loved giving his money away just as much. In his autobiography, Andrew wrote an extensive piece that included his reasons for philanthropy. Included in the piece, Andrew wrote, "I propose to take an income no greater than $50,000 per annum. Beyond this, I need ever earn, make no effort to increase my fortune, but spend the surplus each year for benevolent purposes. Let us cast aside business forever, except for others. Let us settle in Oxford, and I shall get a thorough education, making the acquaintance of literary men. I figure that this will take 3 years active work. I shall pay especial attention to speaking in public. We can settle in London, and I can purchase a controlling interest in some newspaper or live review and give the general management of it attention, taking part in public matters, especially those connected with education and improvement of the poorer classes. Man must have no idol, and the amassing of wealth is one of the worst species of idolatry. No idol is more debasing than the worship of money. Whatever I engage in, I must push inordinately. Therefore, should I be careful to choose that life which will be the most elevating in its character, to continue much longer overwhelmed by business cares, and with most of my thoughts wholly upon the way to make more money in the shortest time, must degrade me beyond hope of permanent recovery. I will resign business at 35, but during these ensuing 2 years, I wish to spend the afternoons in receiving instruction and in reading systematically. Through this manifesto, Andrew pledged that his lifestyle would never reach the level of gaudiness, but that he would always donate money to his peers and the common man. Such heart and an honest outlook on life was truly what made Andrew the contribution he was to the foundation of American industry. Through hard work and generosity, Andrew began leaving the lasting impact on American society he had always sought. For the next 20 years, Andrew began to focus on perfecting the steel industry while also continuing his pledge to philanthropy. In addition to his lifestyle as a businessman, Andrew fulfilled some life dreams during these years, dreams such as meeting Matthew Arnold, an English poet he had long held in high regards. Along with meeting Matthew Arnold, Andrew was able to meet Herbert Spencer and became friends with Mark Twain. Andrew's philanthropic efforts began to be noticed by the public, giving him conversations and friendships with notable Americans and presidents. In 1879, 44-year-old Andrew began giving back to his heritage by donating the necessary funding for the construction of bathrooms for Dunfermline, Scotland. Andrew furthered this pledge when he established the Dunfermline Carnegie Library in his hometown. The library was the first of many that would be constructed from the philanthropic efforts of Andrew Carnegie. Despite being 44, Andrew was unmarried and revealed that he would remain as such for the duration of his mother's life, seeking to attend to her every need. Andrew began caring for her full-time as she aged. In 1881, Andrew wanted to make one last memory that could include his whole family, so he provided an all-expense trip around Europe for his whole family. The trip allowed the family to bond more than before and offered Andrew more inspiration for the future of his philanthropy. As the 1880s continued, Andrew watched as his steel company, Carnegie Steel, was crowned the primary source of U.S. steel in 1885, making it the biggest supplier of pig iron, steel rails, steel armor, and the fuel coke in the world. The company was so big that it produced over 2,000 tons of pig iron each day. As Andrew watched, his monopoly on the production of steel within the United States continued to grow, and consequently, the wealth of Andrew Carnegie continued to grow to new heights each day. As Andrew continued to dominate the steel industry, many began to question how he had risen to such an extensive state in just his first years as president of Carnegie Steel. One factor that greatly aided him in his quest for a monopoly on steel came through a friend of his, Henry Bessemer. Bessemer, a trusted inventor, had created a process for purifying the molten steel that greatly reduced the amount of time in creating steel, while also reducing the cost of creation. Additionally, the Bessemer process allowed for a greater quantity of steel to be created, thus increasing both the quality and the quantity of steel. Another attribute of the success of Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry was his adoption of the vertical integration regarding his suppliers, With a vertically integrated supply chain, Andrew was able to control more aspects of his suppliers, greatly reducing the amount of time needed for the steel-making process. Andrew added to his monopoly on steel with the acquisition of Homestead Steel Works, the chief rival of Carnegie Steel. With the acquisition of the Homestead Steel Works, Andrew was able to procure a state-of-the-art steel plant that included fields saturated with iron and coal. With a railway running to the plant from over 425 miles away, Andrew successfully silenced his chief rival while acquiring a plant that was nicer than the current plant at Carnegie Steel. As Carnegie Steel grew to be one of America's biggest corporations, Andrew began wondering if he should combine some of his assets to create America's biggest industrial corporation. Andrew's financial advisors agreed with Andrew, surmising that combining his assets would bring the greatest financial gain. So Andrew combined the two assets and in 1892 created the Carnegie Steel Company. In 1886, Andrew's mother passed away, leaving Andrew without anyone to care for anymore at the age of 51. Andrew had long said he would not marry until his mother had passed away, and with that requirement fulfilled, Andrew began searching for a wife. After only a few months of searching, Andrew began dating a younger woman, Louise Whitfield. Despite the strong condition of their relationship, Andrew was 21 years older than Louise. Despite the prominent age difference, Andrew and Louise furthered their relationship with marriage, and on April 22nd, 1887, the couple was wed. Friends and family close to the couple note that the marriage was sweet and filled with love, as both enjoyed philanthropy and bestowing kindness upon the common man. The couple would remain childless until 1897, when Louise would give birth to the couple's only child, Margaret. America's second industrial revolution began in the mid-1800s and continued through the days of Andrew's steel-making monopoly. The United States steel operations were creating more steel than Europe, and the steel operation of Andrew Carnegie was largely responsible for its success. Andrew continued to grow his steel company through the creation of J. Edgar Thomasson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. The company was Andrew's dedication to his former supervisor and former place of work, John Edgar Thompson, from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Soon after establishing the steel operations in Braddock, Andrew opened the Bessemer Steel Works right in Pittsburgh, before also opening the Lucy Furnaces a short distance from the Bessemer Steel Works. By the end of the 1880s, Andrew had opened the Union Iron Mills, the Union Mill, the Keystone Bridge Works, the Hartman Steel Works, and the Frick Coke Company, in addition to a set of mines located in Nova Scotia. Andrew had grown his own steel corporation so much that the United States was becoming the primary source of steel for the world. In addition to owning the many functions of the Carnegie Steel Company, Andrew also owned a controlling interest in the landmark Eads Bridge, located in St. Louis, Missouri. The Eads Bridge was of particular interest to the Midwest because it was the first bridge created across the Mississippi River, famously creating more routes of travel once completed. After supplying the steel for the bridge, Andrew oversaw the construction of the bridge and appointed James Eads as the builder and designer of the bridge. Years later, the Gateway Arch would be constructed only blocks away from the Eads Bridge, adding to its significance. Historians regard the Eads Bridge as the greatest of Andrew's constructions, simply because it was the first all-steel bridge built in the world. Additionally, the bridge was created to house railroad lines while being tall enough so that steamboats could navigate underneath the bridge without the threat of scraping their stacks against the bottom of the bridge. Adding to the genius of the engineering of the bridge, a top level was created so that pedestrian travel could be maintained while the trains traveled on the bottom level of the bridge. The bridge's construction captivated the interest of most of America, being one of the first bridges to use pneumatic caissons in its creation. The pneumatic caissons allowed the concrete foundation to be planted firmly beneath the waters of the Mississippi River. Sadly, the caissons were more dangerous than anticipated, and as a result, 15 workers perished due to the dangers of the bends, as the caissons submerged far into the ground. Until 2014, the bridge was the primary route of travel for many entering St. Louis for work each day, showing how the bridge truly renovated life for the citizens of the Midwest. Currently, the bridge houses 2 train tracks, 4 lanes of highway, and provides a route across the Mississippi River for 8,100 vehicles every day. While the bridge was loved by the people of the Midwest for its ease of travel, the bridge served as an example to the world that all steel bridges were the future of construction. At the turn of the 19th century, Andrew was nearing 65 years on this earth and was beginning to contemplate his options for retirement. If one would recall the manifesto regarding philanthropy that Andrew had written so much earlier, they would remember that he had planned on retiring when he was 35 and entering a life of education and reading. However, work had held a different fate for Andrew, and he enjoyed the management of stock and assets so much that he put off retirement until he neared 65. To make his transition to retirement easier, Andrew began merging some of his assets together while transitioning his stock into joint stock corporations. As Andrew continued to publicize his intentions to sell out his steel corporation, many prospective buyers began to appear, interested in the financial statements of the corporation. Among these, none were more notable or even more fit to purchase Andrew's corporation than John Pierpont Morgan, or more commonly known as J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had taken the finances of America by storm and was considered by many to be the greatest and most important financial dealer in the history of America. Prior to approaching Andrew about purchasing Carnegie Steel Company, Morgan had already arranged many blockbuster mergers. In 1892, Morgan financed the merger of the Thomas Houston Electric Company and the Edison General Electric Company to create the General Electric Company. Later in life, Morgan would be influential in creating International Harvester and the telecommunications giant AT&T. Morgan had long held Andrew as an example to follow and was extremely impressed with the efficiency of Andrew's financial decisions. Most importantly, the way in which Andrew was always quick to diversify his profit. Dreaming as only a financial giant would, Morgan was certain he would integrate the entire steel industry so that he could cut costs even more than Andrew had been able to. With the Integrated Steel Corporation, Morgan knew he could raise the wages of his many workers while also offering steel at the lowest price in the world. However, a move of this magnitude would require the complete cooperation by the giants already established in the industry, such as Andrew Carnegie. If Andrew would be willing to sell, Morgan could consolidate the entire steel industry and cut down on the amount of waste being incurred each year. Finally, after months of negotiating with Andrew and other steel capitalists, Morgan was able to arrange for the consolidation of the companies, creating the giant United States Steel Corporation. Once the deal was completed on March 2nd, 1901, the United States Steel Corporation was worth over $1 billion and was the first corporation to be valued as such. Though the steel industry no longer bore the name of Andrew Carnegie, his influence would continue to be felt on the industry for years to come. Though J.P. Morgan was the financial backer of the consolidation, Charles M. Schwab was the actual negotiator for the blockbuster merger. The buyout had taken the stockholders by storm, with it being the largest one in the history of the United States at the time. Stockholders were eager to see how high their shares would skyrocket, and skyrocket they did. The shares were incorporated into a special trust that was created by Morgan and Andrew, the United States Steel Corporation. When the financial statements from the buyout were released to the public, shareholders were shocked to find that Andrew had been bought out for 12 times what the earnings each year for his corporation were. Once added up, Andrew had sold Carnegie Steel for over $480 million, equal to $14.1 billion in 2017 standards. Andrew, of course, did not own the total $480 million, the remainder belonging to his shareholders. Andrew's share was held at around $225 million, an amount that still flabbergasted many of his shareholders. Andrew arranged for his share to be paid to him via gold bonds that would allow him to gain interest on his share, now an investment in the United States Steel Corporation. Andrew had given up his life's work, but had been paid greatly for his contribution. The buyout was so large that it actually accounted for almost 4% of the wealth of the United States. Once the buyout was approved and completed, the bonds were drawn up and sent to the Hudson Trust Company, located in Hoboken, New Jersey. Upon arrival, Andrew's personal secretary, Robert A. Franks, oversaw their delivery, and a slight problem was encountered. The vault was not large enough to house the massive collection of bonds. To ease the burden of so many new bonds, Andrew had a new vault built that could handle the entirety of the large amount of bonds, almost $230 million worth. Following the signing of the contract on February 26, 1901, that consolidated the corporation and turned the ownership over to J.P. Morgan, Andrew became a millionaire who could now focus on his small family and could begin the greatest addition to his legacy, his philanthropy. Though the majority of Andrew's philanthropy would take place after his retirement from the steel industry, there were numerous events that took place prior to his retirement that showcased his compassion and kindness towards humanity. During the early 1880s, Andrew began a campaign to bridge the gap between the British society and American society that he had begun to love. In an attempt to show that the two could exist without animosity, Andrew purchased a majority of the newspapers being published in England in an attempt to eradicate the feel of a monarchy from Europe, while additionally creating what he called a British Republic. Andrew was successful at creating better a relationship between American and British society, but the eradication of a monarchy in Europe was futile under the work of one man simply controlling a few British publications. Europe saw Andrew as an activist for reform, however, adding to the pride with which his home of Scotland revered him with. Noting his hard work, many notable British celebrities befriended Andrew, none more notable than the Prime Minister himself, William Gladstone. While Andrew's life was dominated by success, Andrew held his fair share of grief too. In 1886, Andrew watched helplessly as his younger brother and business partner Thomas passed away at the cold hands of pneumonia. Thomas was Andrew's only living sibling, so understandably, Andrew was devastated by Thomas's death. Adding to the heartbreak of the situation, Andrew had watched as his brother had slipped into the grasp of alcoholism, the result of a dare that turned into a heavy addiction. Following Thomas's death, Andrew provided financial backing to Thomas's wife and her 9 children. As Andrew moved on from his brother's untimely death, he began taking regular tours of the world, speaking at notable universities about success and financial management. During this time, Andrew began to present some of his ideas regarding finance that caused other financial advisors and experts to question his tactics. Andrew presented many of these opinions and hypotheses in his book, An American Four-in-Hand in Britain, a book he wrote after a tour of Europe. Soon Andrew became a figure of activism in America, spurred by his regular and numerous contributions to various American publications. Considered his most controversial work, Andrew published a book titled Triumphant Democracy that went further than simply a few options on financial investment. Triumphant Democracy used a heavy amount of statistics to convince its readers that the British monarchical system was far behind the illustrious American form of government, the Republic. While the book proved to Americans that Andrew was a legitimate advocate for a republic form of government, many in the United Kingdom were deeply offended by the book. The book became a successful publication in America, selling over 40,000 copies. Understandably, the book did not fare as well in Europe. Proving this disappointing reaction, many people celebrated the book's arrival in Europe by burning its pages in the streets. 3 years following his controversial Triumphant Democracy, Andrew published an article titled Wealth in the North American Review. This publication did not target the British government, as so many of Andrew's previous publications had, and upon reading it, Prime Minister William Gladstone asked if he could have the article published in a European publication. Andrew agreed, and the article went on to be published under the title The Gospel of Wealth. This publication became his most well-known contribution to literature, with many financial institutions still adhering to its principles. In the article, Andrew advocated for more philanthropic efforts from those who had amassed significant wealth. The article was an extension of an article Andrew had published years earlier, outlining his plans for retirement and education and such. In The Gospel of Wealth, Andrew asserts, poor and restricted are our opportunities in this life. Narrow our horizon, our best work most imperfect. But rich men should be thankful for one inestimable boon. They have it in their power during their lives to busy themselves in organizing benefactions from which the masses of their fellows will derive lasting advantage, and thus dignify their own lives. Following the article's publication, Andrew would go on to author 3 more books, most recounting the tales and sights he encountered during his travels. As Andrew's career in the steel industry had been nearing its end, Andrew had become more of a political figure, unchained from the financial implications a careless comment could hold for his corporation. Among the many issues Andrew spoke on, British imperialism held priority. Andrew opposed the way that the British government had used the American colonies in the days of the founding of America. Andrew saw countries as being separate entities, not to be forced into submitting to one country's rules and regulations. In 1900, the Philippines had endured a short but harmful war, the Spanish-American War. While the war would last less than a year, those in favor of American imperialism were advocating for the United States to take over the islands of the Philippines. Many saw the islands as offering a prominent location for a new Navy base. Andrew strongly opposed the purchase of the Philippines and offered his support to William Jennings Bryan in his campaign for president in 1900. As Bryant also opposed the takeover of the Philippines. While President McKinley would defeat Bryant and the Philippines would be purchased from Spain by the United States, Andrew's opinion had been noted by the world. Andrew wished for the independence of the Philippines and would even make a futile attempt at arranging for their independence, offering to personally finance the $20 million deal. The deal was rejected, and Andrew returned home disappointed at his failure. While the Treaty of Manila would be signed years after Andrew's death and would give the Philippines complete independence from the United States, the Filipino people recognized an ally in Andrew and appreciated his kindness towards them. In his campaign to make a difference, Andrew joined the American Anti-Imperialist League in 1898, a membership he would maintain until his death. With the purpose of the League to oppose any advancement of annexation against the Philippines, Andrew recruited notable celebrities to join the League. These celebrities included Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, both future presidents of the United States. Additionally, Andrew recruited his friend Mark Twain to join the League. Perhaps Andrew's greatest contribution to society was not merely his financial backing or financial contributions, but more his willing heart and attempts at achieving justice for those that could not fight for themselves. Beginning in 1901, Andrew's efforts turned solely to philanthropy. No longer burdened by the affairs of his corporation, Andrew and Louise were free to visit the world in search of opportunities for their philanthropic efforts. The world took notice too. Andrew had long held the attention of the world, but instead of being in the spotlight for his acute business transactions, now Andrew was in the spotlight as America's most generous philanthropist. Following his retirement, Andrew purchased the luxurious Skibo Castle in Scotland and shared time between the castle and his lavish home in New York City. While looking for ways to spread his wealth around, Andrew began to lend an ear to those requesting money for education. Andrew had long pledged that the majority of his wealth would go towards the advancement of education, casting a compassionate reminder to his early days of spending hours in Colonel James Anderson's private library after work. These letters requesting help were always read personally by Andrew and saved in a drawer titled Gratitude and Sweet Words on his desk. With American education reforming its spelling curriculum, Andrew became a strong advocate for the movement and pledged financial support. Additionally, Andrew founded the Simplified Spelling Board, an organization that sought to reform the English language and simplify the spelling and learning of the English language. To aid the schools using the reformed spelling, Andrew's organization established a Handbook of Simplified Spelling, which proved to be a tremendous aid in the effort to make spelling easier in America. In Andrew's youth, public libraries were few and far between. Andrew saw literacy as the foundation for America's future, and the thought of children being hampered in their reading simply because of the lack of libraries both despaired and inspired him. Of particular inspiration to Andrew was the life of Enoch Pratt. Enoch Pratt had recently died, but his lasting contribution to America was the Enoch Pratt Free Library, located in Baltimore. The library allowed the public to enter its doors and take books that interested them home. Upon Pratt's death in 1896, Andrew remarked, "Pratt was my guide and inspiration." Following in the footsteps of Pratt, Andrew designated much of his wealth to the establishment of public libraries across the United States, into Canada, and even as far as Europe. This alone would be Andrew's most remembered and lasting contribution to society. Andrew began by asking that areas of interest request the grant, which would be personally reviewed by Andrew. However, the requests came in such great magnitude that Andrew became overwhelmed by the amount and had to establish a staff to help sort the requests for libraries. After placing James Bertram in charge of the effort, Andrew began visiting the areas where the construction of a Carnegie library was already beginning. Andrew did not ask much from the communities seeking a library, but among the few requirements, the city must be able to provide sufficient land for the library and would have to maintain the cost of upkeep and management of the library. Among the first libraries created, Andrew donated $500,000 to the city most dear to his heart. Pittsburgh, for a local public library. Only 1 year later, Andrew donated $250,000 to Allegheny City, designated for a music hall that accompanied a small public library. Tipping his hat to his native land, Andrew donated an additional $250,000 to Edinburgh, Scotland, so that they could also have a free library. Following the completion of the last Carnegie Library in 1923, Andrew's fortune had established over 3,000 public libraries across 47 states, while also covering the continents of North America, Africa, Europe, and Australia. Additionally, Andrew donated almost $70,000 for the construction of the University of Birmingham. Andrew's true love was reading, and by establishing free libraries for the citizens, Andrew extended that love to others, while giving a way for the youth to be educated. In his own words, Andrew said, "A library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people. It is a never-failing spring in the desert." Truly, Andrew helped to quench the thirst of many people seeking literature and knowledge. Furthering his pledge to education, Andrew donated $2 million in the establishment of the Carnegie Institute of Technology, located in Pittsburgh. 2 years later, Andrew was approached about establishing a university in Washington, D.C., Andrew jumped at the opportunity to create a new venue of education in the nation's capital and pledged $2 million in creating the Carnegie Institution. Later in his life, as he neared his death, Andrew would donate even more money to the universities. In addition to donating towards the establishment of schools, Andrew also served as a member on the board of directors at Cornell University and the Stevens Institute of Technology. Never failing to remember his native country, Andrew donated $10 million towards a trust named the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. The large donation was an unbelievable donation, and to reward Andrew for his generosity, Scotland named him Lord Rector of the University of St. Andrews. In 1911, Andrew was still busy donating his ever-present wealth to charities and educational causes across the world, when one particular benefit caught his attention. The Carnegie Institution had tasked George Ellery with creating a telescope on Mount Wilson, and funds were running low on the project. Andrew sent a donation of $10 million to the institution and urged the builders to hurry so that he might hear of the telescope's completion before his death. "I hope the work at Mount Wilson will be vigorously pushed," wrote an elderly Andrew Carnegie, "because I am so anxious to hear the expected results from it. I should like to be satisfied before I depart that we are going to repay to the old land some part of the debt we owe them by revealing more clearly than ever to them the new heavens." The telescope, now famously known as the Hooker telescope, was completed on November 2nd, 1917, 2 years before Andrew would pass away. Andrew's wish of seeing the Hooker telescope completed in his lifetime had come true. As a slight change, the man who was dedicated to the purpose of making other people's wishes come true got to have one of his own dreams come true. While Andrew gave most of his wealth to education, he also held a special interest in creating organizations that could repay people. To repay his former employees for their years of labor, Andrew designated a good portion of his remaining fortune for a pension program. Additionally, Andrew created a pension program that would pay a small sum to retired teachers at American universities. Years later, Andrew's pension program for the retired teachers would transition into the TIAA-CREF. While Andrew was a free giver regarding his fortune, he did hold one strict requirement that was deemed unable to be met by a few universities. Andrew required that if any universities had religious affiliations, these ties must be severed before Andrew would donate any money to the school. As a matter of religious conviction, many Protestant universities refused to cut their connections to their respective religions, and thus nullified their possibilities at receiving grants from Andrew. One small aspect of Andrew's life that is relatively unknown is his fascination and love of church organs. Andrew loved the vibrant yet solemn sound offered by the church organs. To further this love, Andrew oversaw the construction of over 7,000 church organs. Additionally, Andrew installed one of the organs in his house, even though neither he nor Louise could play the organ, in addition to providing church organs for thousands of churches. Andrew also was the chief benefactor for Tuskegee Institute, the first all-black university located in Tuskegee, Alabama, operated by Booker T. Washington. Additionally, Andrew proved influential in donating funds so that Washington could establish the National Negro Business League, with a particular emphasis being placed on American heroism in the early 1900s. Andrew established yet another organization, the Carnegie Hero Fund, labeled as an organization that sought to offer monetary rewards for acts of heroism. Andrew personally reviewed every case of heroism for the first few years of the organization's efforts. The organization still exists and has given over $40 million in rewards and grants to date. The organization, housed in Pittsburgh, is still one of the United States' leading organizations that seeks to reward those who aid the disabled or impaired in the community. In 1917, just a few months before the completion of the Hooker telescope, Andrew was given a lasting reward for his philanthropic efforts by the Phi Mu Alpha Sinfonia fraternity from the New England Conservatory of Music. As recognition for his contributions to American music, Andrew was made an honorary member of the fraternity and honored at a private ceremony. The fraternity further paid tribute to Andrew by incorporating his values of charity into their mission statement. During the last years of Andrew's life, his philanthropic efforts were given a second glance by those who deemed his fortune as the result of years of hoarding or even heartless actions. Andrew had been extremely frugal in his early days, but additionally always made sure those who were in debt to him paid off their debts in due time. Joseph Wall wrote a biography of Andrew Carnegie in 1971 and was honored with a Pulitzer Prize for his work. In the book, Joseph writes, "Maybe with the giving away of his money, he would justify what he had done to get that money." Regardless of the opinions one has regarding the ways in which Andrew amassed his wealth, one would be hard-pressed to prove that Andrew was selfish with his wealth in his last days. Having given over $350 million to charity, Andrew successfully imparted his greatest asset, money, back to the public, and more so, to those who actually needed the wealth. If his philanthropic efforts failed to satisfy the question of his charity, perhaps his example to others would be. With his article, The Gospel of Wealth, Andrew created more philanthropic efforts and set the example as America's most generous philanthropist during the early 20th century. On August 11th, 1919, Andrew Carnegie passed away, succumbing to the same disease his brother Thomas had died of so many years earlier, pneumonia. Following his death, the remainder of his fortune, almost $30 million, was split up between various charities and universities across the world. Andrew Carnegie was buried at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Ironically, Andrew was laid to rest only feet away from one of his peers, Samuel Gompers, a fellow industrialist who made great changes in the labor force regulations in the early 1900s. Shortly before his death, Andrew wrote in his journal a piece which many have referred to as the Andrew Carnegie dictum. In this piece, Andrew asserts that the world would be improved if one followed a three-step process. First, One should spend the first third of his life by investing in as much education as he could. Second, one should use the second third of his life making as much money as he could. Third, one should use the last third of his life by giving away his fortune so that others can follow in his footsteps and fulfill the Andrew Carnegie dictum. Through the life of Andrew Carnegie, the world was given a benchmark to follow that would fulfill every man. By fulfilling the needs of others, one can feel the joy of his life and establish a legacy. The legacy of Andrew Carnegie includes the foundation of his hard work and ingenuity in the steel industry, but concludes with his generosity and compassion. In his own words, "If you want to be happy, set a goal that commands your thoughts, liberates your energy, and inspires your hopes." Cornelius Vanderbilt. Many view education as the single most important key to gaining a life of ease and comfort. So much importance is placed on education that many pour their lives into 4 years of higher education, only to follow that with 2 more years to complete a master's degree. After that, some continue to pursue a doctorate. While some of these students will be able to apply their degree to their field of work, the sad majority of graduates find that their degree is either not applicable to their field of work or not a requirement of their job, rendering their last years of education and thousands of dollars worthless. To better discover the necessary elements of success, one would be wise to study the life of millionaire philanthropist Cornelius Vanderbilt. Ironically, when one thinks of the name Vanderbilt, their mind immediately goes to the 333-acre campus of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. However, while Cornelius Vanderbilt was the philanthropist responsible for the college's birth, he did not even complete high school. How does a high school dropout become one of America's richest men? By laying the foundation of the American railroad and steamboat industry. In Cornelius's own words, "If I had learned education, I would not have had time to learn anything else." Hard work and a persevering attitude separated Cornelius from the other men of his time, planting him firmly in the seat of a locomotive bound for success. Cornelius Vanderbilt will forever serve as an example to posterity that an education is only valuable if it does not inhibit the hard work necessary for success. Only when hard work is coupled with intelligence will the natural man discover the flares of success that Cornelius Vanderbilt discovered so long ago. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born to Cornelius Van der Bilt and Phoebe Hand on May 27th of 1794 in the metropolis of industry, Staten Island, New York. Cornelius came from a rich history of hard workers that had little time for the pomp and frills of life. His great-great-grandfather, Jan Utzon, emigrated to New York in 1650 under the label of an indentured servant. Prior to emigrating to America, Jan had worked as a Dutch farmer from Bilt, a small village nestled in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The surname Vanderbilt originates from this village. The Dutch traditionally called each other according to their geographic location, using the phrase van der, which translates to of the. Because the Utzon family was from the village of Bilt, the name was combined to create Vanderbilt, which was passed down through the generations, even after the Vanderbilt family emigrated to America. Before Jan passed away, he gave his small tract of land in Staten Island to his sons. From land records dating to Jan's immigration in the late 1600s, historians have found that Jan acquired his land from the Native Americans inhabiting New Amsterdam, now New York. Jan bequeathed his land to his son Jacob, the grandfather of Cornelius. When Cornelius was born, his father was operating a small ferry that brought passengers around the New York harbor. While Cornelius was enrolled in a local school, his love was found outdoors. Cornelius found the rigors and studies of school boring and worthless in his fascination with the unknown features of the woods that stood outside his home. With Cornelius's father operating a ferry, Cornelius was given a love for the water at a young age. When he was but a 5-year-old, Cornelius could skillfully navigate a periauger, the small boat his father would use to ferry produce to the local market. Because of his proficiency in sailing, Cornelius' father compelled him to quit school when he was 11 so that he could help on his father's ferry service. Though Cornelius's mom was against the move, thinking that her son's future depended on him being able to complete a proper education, Cornelius saw the move as his escape from school. Given his way of escape, Cornelius Vanderbilt quit school at the age of 11, never to complete his education. When Cornelius began working on his father's ferry, his immediate love connection with the water confirmed that he had made the correct decision. For his father, Cornelius proved to be an asset, manning ships that grown men struggled with while he was only 12 years old. When Cornelius's father expanded his ferry service to provide a rescue operation for ships that had been wrecked on the rocks surrounding Staten Island, Cornelius was often placed in command of the rescue teams that retrieved the sunken vessels and their cargo. Cornelius was living his best life, and the thought of school soon became a distant murmur that no force of man could reconcile with Cornelius. When Cornelius turned 16, his work for his father began to tax on his life of freedom, and soon his aspirations of owning his own ferry business superseded his love of working for his father. However, traditional law at the time of Cornelius's youth bound the young man to the trade of his father until the youth turned 21. Unable to cope with the idea of working for his father until he was 21, Cornelius made plans to run away from home and start his own ferry operation. However, the love of his mother and the promise of a loan of $100 to purchase his own periauger brought the boy back from his intents of running away. Along with the loan, his mother allowed Cornelius to begin working a small patch of land, 8 acres wide, to grow his own crops. Cornelius enjoyed the new freedom, limited as it was, and agreed to remain at home under his father's ferry operation. Armed with his new periauger, Cornelius began his own operation on the side, ferrying passengers from Staten Island to Manhattan and then back again. Other captains, impressed by the attitude of exuberance with which he performed his tasks, though he was just a youth, nicknamed Cornelius the Commodore, a nickname that would remain with Cornelius until his death. It would be easy for one to dismiss the life Cornelius lived as being a life of ease, simply because he was doing what he loved every day of his life. However, tensions at this time in history were high. War with England seemed only moments away, and the minds of most Americans were filled with fear and fraught with worry. Jobs were becoming scarce, and the mindset of every American was to work as hard as possible now, so that if war with England did occur, the Americans would be prepared. Cornelius was no different, and lived each day on the ferry as it were his last day working. Cornelius also felt stressed from the government because they were set on making Staten Island more independent should war come. Times were stressful indeed for Cornelius, so when the added stress of repaying his mother's loan poised its face in Cornelius's mind, the man became set on working tirelessly until it was paid off. Finally, after working 16-hour days until he had enough money, Cornelius was able to deliver the value of the loan to his mother, thus repaying her in full for what she had loaned him almost a year earlier. The Vanderbilt dynasty had been long-time members of the Episcopal Church, and many surmised that Cornelius would be no different. However, Cornelius found his beliefs more in line with the Moravian Church and sought to join a local chapter. Sadly, Cornelius was disappointed to learn that no such church existed in his city. However, when Cornelius learned that there were other Moravians in his city that sought to worship together, he helped lead a building project to construct a church for the Moravians in Staten Island. With the help of Cornelius, the church was completed, and Cornelius was able to worship alongside like-minded members of his faith. He would be a member of the church until his death. During these months, Cornelius continued to keep his ferry open as much as possible to create a sizable savings account. Through months of hard work, Cornelius worked his way through various employers in the New York harbor until he was finally named captain, along with being a co-owner of the largest periauger in the city's harbor. However, the celebration of his promotion was significantly dampened by the announcement of war. James Madison had declared war on England, drawing America into a bloody war that would require resources and the aid of every American. The War of 1812 had begun. With the War of 1812 grabbing all attention and all big businesses, the resulting economy was hurting the smaller businessmen of America. However, the war brought new opportunities for employment for Cornelius. With other means of transportation skyrocketing, the ferries became the primary means of transportation, thus increasing Cornelius's weekly flow of traffic. Also adding to Cornelius's budding employment opportunities were special contracts from the United States government that included ferrying supplies to various forts across the eastern coastline. For the duration of the war, Cornelius would ferry passengers in the daytime and supplies for the government at night. Cornelius began to make a name for himself as a daring and sometimes reckless captain, often taking the most dangerous missions from the government. While Cornelius was never afraid to push the boundaries of safety, his missions were all completed, adding to his impressive record as a ferryboat captain. During one such mission, the British seemed poised for another attack off the coast of Sandy Hook, but were held off by a sudden storm that threatened the safety to the British fleet. During the storm, American reinforcements needed to be shuttled to the site to be ready for the next attack. Cornelius was called upon to undertake the dangerous mission, and upon completion was asked by an officer whether or not he thought he could pilot the boat back in such a storm. Cornelius responded, "I can if the boat is handled properly." The officer then implored Cornelius to take the remaining officers to the battery as to provide more reinforcement there. Cornelius readily agreed, but noted that, "I shall have to carry you part of the way underwater." The officer seemed perplexed at such a thought, but agreed to the offer nonetheless. Cornelius successfully delivered the soldiers to the battery, and upon their arrival, not one of them was dry. As the war raged on, Cornelius watched as his fellow captains in the ferry operations were forced to put their ferries up for sale, squashed by the economic hardships of the war. Cornelius saw this as a tremendous opportunity to build a bigger fleet and create more wealth. When 2 seagoing ships were offered to him for sale, Cornelius immediately accepted and purchased the ships. At the young age of 18, Cornelius was the proud owner of 2 ships and the captain of another ship. In 1813, a nervous 19-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt proposed marriage to his first cousin named Sophia Johnson. After she accepted, the two were married and moved out of Cornelius's dilapidated apartment and into a small boarding house located on the famous Broad Street of Lower Manhattan. The two enjoyed a fruitful marriage, parenting 13 children together. Cornelius's ferry business continued to grow, and by the age of 23, Cornelius was worth $9,000 along with his fleet of ships. While the trade of piloting a ship was his career of choice, Cornelius was never involved in just one investment. Sundry tasks demanded the time of Cornelius, including peddling, ferrying, trading and transporting various freight along the eastern coast. In addition to growing a fleet of ships, Cornelius began modifying his vessels to make them sail faster and more securely. When other captains examined the vessels of Cornelius, they made the same changes to their own vessels, thus igniting a ripple effect from Cornelius's skillful engineering and making him both a trusted source in the ferry operations and a legend among the locals of Staten Island. While Cornelius was busy ferrying his passengers by use of ships with sails, Robert Fulton was unveiling his new wonder to the world, a ferry run completely by a steam engine. Cornelius was intrigued by the concept of foregoing a sail for an engine. Enticed by the gossip, Cornelius boarded a steamer bound for Albany and watched in amazement as the ferry pushed its way through the waters, unbound by the lack of wind Cornelius was used to facing. Upon arriving in Albany, Cornelius remarked to a stranger that the steamboat would replace the sail. However, steamboats were rarer than the sail ferries and were not yet the primary source of transportation. At the time, the state of New York had given Robert Fulton and his operation a 30-year monopoly on any steamboat operations. This monopoly had discouraged many steamboat captains, with the exception of a young man named Thomas Gibbons. Gibbons was undeterred by the legislature of New York and offered Cornelius a job piloting one of his steamboats. Despite being guaranteed over $3,000 a year from his sail ferry operations, Cornelius sold his remaining vessels and accepted the job working for Thomas Gibbons as a steamboat captain on the Mouse of the Mountain. Though the transition from sail ferry to steamboat captain offered Cornelius $2,000 less in his annual salary, Cornelius saw the future of navigation being owned solely by the steamboat and viewed the transition as an investment in his future. Little did Cornelius know, steamboats would be where he would first receive his taste of being a millionaire. The smaller watercraft allowed Cornelius to learn the operations of a steamboat. While unknown to Cornelius, Thomas Gibbons was a fierce competitor of Robert Fulton, the very man who had ignited Cornelius's interests in steamboats. Part of the fierce battle between Gibbons and Fulton was based on New York giving Fulton the sole ownership of all steamboat operations on any waterways within New York. With Gibbons's encouragement, Cornelius began making daring and illegal trips up the New York waterways in Gibbons's steamboat, ferrying passengers along the eastern coast. Often, Cornelius would have to use his skillful piloting to evade capture and arrest from those seeking to enforce the monopoly given to Fulton. Though the battle involved Fulton's vessels, the legal battle was between Thomas Gibbons and Aaron Ogden, Fulton's kin in charge of the steamboats. After 7 years, the Supreme Court ruled in Gibbons' favor that the privilege of being the sole operator of all steamboats was unconstitutional in the landmark case Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons was then able to begin expanding his business as a steamboat operator. Ironically enough, Robert Fulton was not even alive by the time Gibbons began his operations of steamboats along the New York coastline. Regardless, Gibbons was excited to start his operations and implored Cornelius to stay as his business manager. Fulton's manager also offered Cornelius a well-paying job to pilot their own steamboats. However, Cornelius refused on the grounds, "I don't care half so much about making money as I do about making my point and coming out ahead." Cornelius agreed to stay with Gibbons and manage the operations of the Bellona. While Gibbons had created the steamboat operation and provided the funding, he left the day-to-day operations under the sole leadership of Cornelius. Under his frugal leadership, the steamboat operations proved immensely fruitful for Gibbons, earning Cornelius a pay raise. When Thomas Gibbons passed away in 1826, Cornelius helped Gibbons' son, William, transition to leadership. However, tensions between William and Cornelius grew tight, and before long, the two were not getting along. As Cornelius continued to pilot Gibbons' steamboat, he began to contemplate starting his own steamboat operation. Though earning a lucrative salary of $40,000 a year, Cornelius wanted to once again be his own master, and in 1829 left the operations of Thomas Gibbons to start his own. Robert Fulton had been dead for 15 years, but his contribution to society was causing ripples through more than just the waterways. Steamboat passage was at an all-time high and only continued to grow. More and more pedestrians saw the steamboat as the cheapest viable option of transportation, causing a business boom of sorts for anyone operating a steamboat. After Cornelius left the operations of William Gibbons, he began buying up the smaller ferry operations in the New York region. While Cornelius was beginning his operations as a steamboat captain, many more experienced men had functioning operations all along the East Coast, leading to intense competition between Cornelius and the other steamboat captains. With American transportation centering on the waterways, Americans were buying more space on steamboats, but the competition was leading to financial ruin for some while providing gain for others. Among Cornelius's most intense competitors were Stevens of Hoboken and a New Yorker named Daniel Drew. These men had long-standing operations along the East Coast and were far from willing to allow a new man to rob them of their customers. Cornelius saw that their operations were far too big to simply rob their customers by undercutting their ticket prices, so he began improvising his next strategy. Cornelius found that if he altered his watercraft, he could make them faster and able to carry more customers. Cornelius also sacrificed the pleasures many of the larger steamboat operations offered so that he could provide faster transportation. It was a gamble that offered his current success as collateral for future success, but the risk paid off. Cornelius, the ever-vigilant man of frugality, also trimmed his overhead until the ticket prices were almost all profit. By doing so, Cornelius became the king of the Eastern Coast, with many customers switching their business from the larger operations to Cornelius's growing operation. The success of Cornelius forced his competitors to cut their prices until they could no longer operate at a profit, forcing them to sell their operations to Cornelius. One man that Cornelius never bought out was Daniel Drew. Once fierce competitors, Daniel Drew and Cornelius formed a partnership that ensured neither side would buy the other competitor out. The partnership lasted for the next 30 years and ended only when Daniel Drew declared bankruptcy due to poor financial investments. For Cornelius, however, times had never been better. The steamboat captain now oversaw the entirety of the Eastern Coast waterway operations, ensuring that the middle school dropout was now the owner of the steamboat monopoly on the Eastern Coast. From 1829 to 1850, Cornelius would rule the steamboat operations and accrue more wealth than was known to mankind at the time. While the strategy of his steamboat engineering was cause for his immense traffic flow, Cornelius also exhibited his financial genius throughout these times. Perhaps the greatest attribute to the financial genius of Cornelius was his willingness to indulge in risk for a higher reward. One of Cornelius's riskier decisions was not insuring any ships or captains. According to Cornelius, good vessels and good captains are the best insurance. If corporations can make money by insuring, so can I. In 1833, Cornelius's life of risk almost came to its close when the steamboat captain was almost killed while on a train located on the Camden and Amboy Railroad of New Jersey. The train derailed due to a broken axle, but thankfully Cornelius escaped death along with another notable figure aboard the train, former President John Quincy Adams, whose son unfortunately perished in the accident. Cornelius was very lucky to have escaped with only a punctured lung and 2 cracked ribs, and spent the next month recuperating from his serious injuries. When 1834 rolled around, Cornelius was enjoying a nice monopoly on the Eastern Coast waterway transportation. However, that was not the case on the Hudson River. Cornelius was under intense competition from the Hudson River Steamboat Association, a steamboat line that ran between New York City and Albany. Cornelius recognized that his competitors held the favor with their larger ships and lower fares. In an effort to appear as more of a commoner, Cornelius adapted the title The People's Line for his Hudson River steamboat operation, aligning himself staunchly with President Andrew Jackson. However, the Hudson River Steamboat Association won the popularity vote with its customers, and Cornelius was forced to accept a buyout from the company. Undeterred by his lack of success in the Hudson River, Cornelius continued to grow his operations along the Long Island Sound while continuing his monopoly on the eastern coast. As Cornelius continued to make savvy financial decisions, his operations began to, until by 1845, Cornelius owned the operations of 100 steamboats that traversed the Long Island Sound. In addition to holding the monopoly on steamboats, Cornelius also held the most employees of any business in America, granting him more fame than he ever imagined. As part of the strategic genius of Cornelius, he preyed upon the frantic wishes of the 49ers during the California Gold Rush of 1849 by providing a steamboat that would deliver its passengers to California via a shortcut that cut an astounding 600 miles off the trip, while also offering the passage at half the price of land travel. Through moves like this, Cornelius crept into the hearts of the American people while also having a firm grasp on their pocketbooks. In 1850, Cornelius began facing significant competition from the Pacific Mail Steamship, a company that ran its customers through the Isthmus of Panama. However, the costs began to catch up with the company as Cornelius's strategic navigation ensured that he was still seeing profits 10 times higher than that of the Pacific Mail Steamship. 3 years later, Cornelius helped to stifle some of this competition by locating 3 of his steamboats on the eastern coast and 4 steamboats on the western coast. In the following years, Cornelius would allocate more of his ships on the eastern coast, simply due to the greater need on that side of the United States. While Cornelius had long found his success in steamboats, another mode of transportation began to gather his interests in the later 1830s. With the textile mills beginning their boom, mills were being built all along the New England coastline, causing a need for improved transportation between the states. To get the cotton from the deep south all the way to the mills of New England, railroads were built along the roads of Boston that connected the city with the Long Island Sound. Once the connection from Boston to the Long Island Sound was completed, the merchants were able to ship their goods all the way from Boston to New York with little effort. With Cornelius in complete control of the steamboats that had routes to New York, he saw a great opportunity to control more transportation through the railroads. One railroad that was of interest to Cornelius was the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad. This railroad, known more commonly as the Stonington, was the most popular railroad on the eastern coast. Cornelius saw this railroad as his greatest opportunity at entering the industry and decided to purchase stock in the company. After convincing the competing railroad lines to cut their prices, Cornelius watched as the stock price of Stonington fell until he was able to purchase a controlling stake and take over as president in 1847. For Cornelius, the railroad now offered him the perfect route to controlling a monopoly on all American transportation. For the American people, a genius was now in charge of two of their most popular modes of transportation, breeding confident yet anxious feelings about his future in transportation. If operating the most successful steamboat line while simultaneously beginning the operations to own a railroad line intimidated Cornelius, he showed no signs of it. In addition to managing these two operations, Cornelius also began purchasing real estate in Lower Manhattan and Staten Island, effectively owning much of the public property of New York. In 1838, Cornelius added to his impressive collection with the acquisition of the famous Staten Island Ferry, which is still in existence today. When the 1840s ended, Cornelius had gathered over $1 million a year in profit, and was now only referred to by his nickname, the Commodore. The year was 1852. Cornelius was approaching 60 years old, but was unwilling to relinquish his firm grasp on the many operations under his command. Cornelius was still working just as hard as he always had, a trademark of the success he was now enjoying. However, not all of Cornelius's life was filled with bliss. That year, the aging millionaire was involved in an altercation with Joseph L. White from the Accessory Transit Company. At this time, Cornelius was loved by the American people, but largely hated by others in his industry, as he continued to drive the smaller operations out of business. Cornelius had purchased a controlling interest in the company, and Joseph opposed this move, sensing that Cornelius was about to buy out his company, as Cornelius has done to so many other companies. However, Cornelius won the dispute, and as part of Joseph's retribution from the altercation, Cornelius forced the Accessory Transit Company to purchase some of his ships for an astronomically inflated price tag. With the money acquired through the sale, Cornelius hosted his family as they toured Europe on one of his own boats, a steamboat yacht named the North Star. The North Star proved to be more than just a mode of transportation from America to Europe. Many of the Europeans flocked to the dock to see the largest yacht to dock in their harbor. However, while Cornelius was away enjoying his vacation, Joseph White collaborated with Charles Morgan, one of Cornelius's most trusted friends, in a conniving plan that denied Cornelius the funds of retribution promised to him by White. When Cornelius returned and discovered the plot, he fought back, giving the company warning. "Gentlemen," said Cornelius, "you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for law is too slow. I will ruin you." And ruin he did, by implementing a steamboat operation that ran to California, threatening the profits of the Accessory Transit Company. Faced with the plight of being bought out by Cornelius, White paid his debt to Cornelius, and Cornelius ceased his operations to California. Following Cornelius's battle with the Accessory Transit Company, Cornelius began running transatlantic steamboat lines to compete with the Collins Line, a steamboat line piloted by Edward K. Collins. As Cornelius had done with so many other transportation lines, he soon overwhelmed the Collins Line and bought out the company. In addition to heading up the transatlantic steamboat operations, Cornelius also purchased a controlling interest in Allaire Iron Works, earning him a shipyard to store and maintain his steamboats. Additionally, the Allaire Iron Works was the largest manufacturer of steam engines for steamboats located in Manhattan. In 1855, Cornelius turned his interests once again to the operations of the Accessory Transit Company. After buying control in the company, Cornelius owned the controlling share, and his revenge on Joseph White was complete. However, more excitement than Cornelius had ever experienced awaited him in November of the same year, the excitement that would begin the foundation of the legacy Cornelius would lay for posterity. Shortly after Cornelius gained the controlling share of the Accessory Transit Company, William Walker, a militia leader from America, entered the country of Nicaragua and led a coup that overtook the Nicaraguan government. This directly tied into Cornelius because the Accessory Transit Company was heavily invested in the Nicaraguan transportation system, with many of their steamboats residing there. Adding to the crisis of the situation, Walker convinced his friend, Edmund Randolph, to talk to the accessory transit agent located in San Francisco, Cornelius Garrison, and convince him to betray his friend, Cornelius Vanderbilt. While Walker was in control of the government of Nicaragua, Randolph had him nullify the accessory transit charter that had allowed the company unlimited transportation within the country. With the charter nullified, Walker seized Cornelius's steamboats in Nicaragua and gave them to none other than his friend, Edmund Randolph. Randolph then sold the seized steamboats to Cornelius Garrison, the very man who had betrayed Cornelius Vanderbilt in San Francisco. As Cornelius Vanderbilt stood by and watched helplessly as one of his most profitable steamboat lines was illegally confiscated, he sought the aid of the American government in providing restitution and justice. However, the government refused and offered no explanation as to why they did not help. Without the aid of the American government, Cornelius was forced to seek the aid of Costa Rica in bringing Walker to justice. Costa Rica had already declared war on Walker, and thus were encouraged by the aid of Cornelius. Cornelius provided a man who was sent into Nicaragua and captured the steamboats of Cornelius back again. Without the steamboats, Walker had no access to his reinforcements and was forced to surrender his brief stint as leader of the Nicaraguan government. After Walker was dismissed from the country courtesy of a U.S. Navy officer who physically led Walker from the country, Cornelius sought to reinstitute his steamboat operations in Nicaragua. However, with the new government afraid of any American interference, Cornelius was not allowed to reinstate his steamboats and was ordered to remove his possessions from the country. Faced with no way to re-enter Nicaragua, Cornelius mapped a new route that used Panama and was still shorter than any other line that led to California. This move worked out for Cornelius in the long run, as it offered him the opportunity to expand his monopoly on steamboat operations to California. As Cornelius watched, his wealth continued to grow, as did the disdain for him from other transportation companies around America. For Cornelius, his new efforts would be in providing transportation from continent to continent, not just America. While steamboats were the pride and joy of Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was beginning to amass more railroad lines, leading to more time and effort being placed on allocating locomotives and rail cars. Whereas Cornelius had begun with the Stonington earlier, his interests began to seep into other rail lines that offered great profit if managed properly. Most notably, Cornelius became interested in the Erie Railway, the Central Railroad in New Jersey, the Hartford and New Haven Railroad, and the New York and Harlem Railroad. Cornelius's most successful method of gaining control of the railroads was to purchase a controlling interest in the company, where he would then work his way up the totem pole of leadership in the company until he was the president of the rail line. In addition to owning many lines, Cornelius served on almost every board of directors for trains at the time. Cornelius continued to focus on improving the rail lines he owned, allowing him to cut prices so much that the ticket price of a ride on one of the rail lines almost entirely went to the profit of Cornelius. However, while the locomotive business was lucrative and was gathering more steam as the days progressed, America was on the verge of another war. Cornelius, having survived the War of 1812 and making a profit during a time when most Americans were facing a small recession, saw the threats of war as minimal. Cornelius largely operated under the mindset that a profit could be made in any atmosphere, including an atmosphere of war. However, the next war would be more personal than any other war America had fought or would ever fight. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War officially began. America was at war with herself. As America began allocating resources to either the North or the South during the Civil War, Cornelius sought to help maintain the Union by offering his personal steamboat, the Vanderbilt, to the Navy of the Union. Cornelius saw it as an acceptable option that could be the difference in the battle for waters between the North and the South. However, the Union's Secretary of the Navy thought differently and refused the offer of the ship on the grounds that the maintenance of such a large vessel would be far too much for the short duration of the war. America had her eyes on a short war, and the Vanderbilt was an unnecessary added cost. With the Union not accepting his ship, Cornelius was forced to lease the ship to the War Department for much lower than the ship's actual value. However, the tides began to turn when the South noticed the small navy of the Union. With the War of the Waters becoming more important every day, the South began attacking the Northern vessels using their destructive wonder, the Virginia, more commonly known as the Merrimac. The ironclad vessel was causing an impasse for the Northern ships, so Secretary of War Edwin Stanton asked President Abraham Lincoln if he could request the aid of Cornelius Vanderbilt. President Lincoln readily agreed, and soon Cornelius was where he most enjoyed, modifying vessels to fit the need of the times. Following a brief letter from Stanton to Cornelius, which read, "For what sum will you contract to destroy the Merrimac or prevent her from coming out from Norfolk, you to sink or destroy her if she gets out? Answer by telegraph, as there is no time to be lost." A response by telegraph would not be necessary, however, as Cornelius was already in Washington, confident that the Union would soon be requesting his help. Given the go-ahead to make a ship worth destroying anything in its path, Cornelius put his mind and wit to the task, finishing the boat in record time. When finished, the Vanderbilt had been outfitted with a battering ram on its stern and filled with a staff that had been personally chosen by Cornelius. After only one battle between the two prized vessels from each side, the Vanderbilt successfully cornered the Merrimac. After the vessel was being seized, Cornelius was placed in charge of modifying it to fit the Union's needs. Cornelius converted the former destroyer into a cruiser that was tasked with finding the Alabama, a Confederate raider that was wreaking havoc on the eastern coast. Courtesy of its captain, Raphael Semmes, after Cornelius had agreed to modify the Vanderbilt, he revealed that President Lincoln had asked him if he was capable of hindering the Virginia from working. "I replied to him," wrote Cornelius, "that it was my opinion that if the steamship Vanderbilt was there properly manned, the Merrimac would not venture to come out, or if she did, that the chances were 10-1 that the Vanderbilt could sink and destroy her. No vessel had been, or could be, made by the rebels that could stand the concussion or stand before the weight of the Vanderbilt." Following the war, Cornelius was recognized for his invaluable donation of the Vanderbilt. Cornelius was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for his generosity in donating the Vanderbilt to the war. In addition to donating the Vanderbilt, Cornelius also privately donated enough money for a group of explorers to make an expedition that wound throughout the United States before culminating in New Orleans. Cornelius Vanderbilt played a monumental role in the Civil War simply through his willingness to be used. Whereas his first offer was refused, Cornelius never lost hope, and maintained his hard work and was therefore ready when the Union came calling. Through his example, one can learn that simply working hard in the little things will make way for the larger opportunities. Following the war, Cornelius was seen a hero to the other steamboat captains of America. Captains rushed to shake his hand and congratulate him on his valuable addition to the Union's navy. However, the joy of winning the war was dampened significantly when Cornelius's youngest son, George Washington Vanderbilt, contracted an incurable disease and died. George had been enrolled in the United States Military Academy, and while he did graduate, he passed away before ever being able to join combat. The loss devastated Cornelius. George had been his favorite son, rumored to be heir to the entirety of Cornelius's fortune. However, Cornelius would pick himself up as he had done so many times before and move on. For now, Cornelius diverted most of his interests to his railroads. Cornelius had been vigilant in amassing railroad lines to complement his impressive train collection. In 1863, Cornelius was able to gain control of the Harlem Railroad line in his trademark style, by cornering the stock of Harlem until he owned more than a controlling share. Following the change of leadership in the railroad line, the board of directors unanimously elected Cornelius as the president of the railroad, giving him another line to add to his record. Ironically, many considered the Harlem Railroad line to be completely worthless and unworthy of the attention Cornelius was paying to it. However, Cornelius saw the railroad line as an opportunity to showcase his financial genius to the world. Cornelius was determined to prove that he could make something successful out of a company that was largely bankrupt. It was so bad that many of the shareholders had threatened to remove their support unless Cornelius was named president. A culmination of years of dishonest financial dealings, the state of affairs at Harlem seemed beyond repair. If the shaky financial state was not enough to scare investors away, the physical state of the equipment would have been cause for any potential investor to reconsider. The trains were literally falling apart, and the stations were in disrepair. At the time of Cornelius's takeover of the company, the stock price was set at a meager $3. However, after Cornelius began to correctly manage the company, investors were shocked to watch the stock price rise first to $7 and then to $8. Before long, the stock was knocking on the doors of $50 a share, a stark contrast to the days of forecasting bankruptcy. In addition to viewing the railroad as a profitable potential, Cornelius also saw that the rail line was one of its kind for more than one reason. The Harlem was the lone steam engine that would run to downtown Manhattan. The railroad ran from 4th Street along 26th Street before ending with a streetcar that ran passengers from the rail line to the heart of Manhattan. Cornelius recognized the tourist attraction this rail line could be, possibly adding to his urgency in fixing the state of the Harlem rail lines. To better surround the members of the Harlem management with success, Cornelius turned to an inside source, his son, Billy Vanderbilt. Billy was the eldest of Cornelius Vanderbilt's sons, and while eager to follow in his father's footsteps, found the path more difficult than anticipated. During the early years of the relationship between Cornelius and Billy, friends and family noticed that Cornelius was often very frustrated with Billy, calling him a blockhead and a waste. As part of Billy's education, Cornelius sent him to study in the Columbia Grammar School. Cornelius often tried to impart his wisdom on his son, but as the eldest, Billy was eager to prove that he could succeed on his own. Unfortunately, such was not the case. In a fit of anger and frustration, Cornelius sent Billy to work with his friend, Daniel Drew, hoping that a brief stint with someone other than himself could prove to Billy Cornelius's way of financial investment was superior. When Cornelius dropped Billy off at his job with Daniel Drew, he remarked that nothing special would become of the unruly lad. As Billy continued to work for Drew, he became so engrossed in the work that he began to succeed for the first time in his life. Convinced that Cornelius had simply been too hard on the lad, Drew began giving Billy more responsibility and raising his pay until the lad went from a meager pay of $150 a year to $1,000 a year in only the third year of his job. Hoping for a partnership with Daniel, the apprentice continued to work tirelessly at his trade in financial investing. During these tiring months, Billy also got married to the daughter of a pastor employed at the Dutch Reformed Church of Albany. As Billy continued to work tirelessly to prove to his father that he was capable of much more, Billy's health began to take a turn for the worst. Unsure of what was ailing his son, Cornelius sought the aid of the family physician, who informed Cornelius that Billy needed to be removed from such a stagnant environment of simply sitting at a desk, or he would certainly die at a young age. After Billy suffered a nervous breakdown at work one day, Cornelius was certain he had to intervene in his son's life. Unwilling to lose another son to an early death, Cornelius immediately removed Billy from his work with Drew and purchased 70 acres of land in Staten Island for his son to live on and maintain. For the next 20 years, Billy and his wife Maria maintained a life on the small acreage of Staten Island, where Billy managed investments for his father. During these months, Cornelius watched as his son doubled the profits of his investments, greatly impressing Cornelius. When the opportunity arose from the Harlem Rail Line, Cornelius knew just the man fit for the job. Once the scourge of his life, Cornelius promoted Billy to the role as vice president in the Harlem Rail Lines, eager to see what his son could do given sufficient resources. The renewed relationship between father and his son represented a family restored to Cornelius. Additionally, it represented a new business partner, something Cornelius had not had since the days of his partnership with Daniel Drew. At the turn of 1864, Cornelius began selling his steamboat operations until he had sold every last one. With the railroad line's business booming, Cornelius saw the days of steamboat travel limited and wished to remove himself from the trade while he was still making a profit. For the other captains in the steamboat industry, Cornelius's departure was a day of jubilation. Finally, the days of equal trade would return, and competition would be more spread out amongst the various captains. For those in the railroad industry, Cornelius's departure from the steamboat industry spelled doom for them, with many engineers certain Cornelius would soon overtake the rail industry and control the monopoly on this form of American travel. With the success of Harlem showing no ceiling, Cornelius commenced construction on a new branch, with a line being built from the station in New York to the Battery. Armed with the confidence in Cornelius's leadership, investors began to flock to Harlem, leading the stock of the railway to surpass $75, only 1 week after the contribution on the new line began. 2 weeks later, the stock surpassed $100 a share. The Cornelius effect was being felt all throughout the rail industry. Once a hated man for his genius, Cornelius now had a Midas touch of sorts, with anything possessing his name becoming a success overnight. Adding to Cornelius's genius was his ability to manipulate the stock market. Many of the laws concerning financial trade that exist now find their roots in business transactions originating from Cornelius Vanderbilt. In June of 1865, the alderman of the board of directors for the Harlem Rail Line connived a way to repurchase more stock from the public. The alderman proposed that the members of the board sell all their stock to the public, which would greatly lower the cost of the stock. With the price of the stock greatly deflated, the board of directors could repurchase the stock at the lower price, a move that would result in the price greatly inflating after repurchase. The plan was intended to remain confidential, but as friends confided in friends, the plans were soon known by hundreds of men who began selling Harlem stock. Even the president of Harlem Railroad Lines found out about the plan and complied with the instructions. The plan worked, but soon Harlem was on the brink of disaster when it was discovered that the company had sold more shares of stock than existed. When the Supreme Court found out about such a financial travesty, they issued an injunction that commanded Harlem to cease laying the rails of its new line until the correct amount of stock shares was reached. With Harlem in hot water for their fiasco, many surmised that the stock price of Harlem would fall below $50. However, Cornelius remained confident in his son and let his son correct the issues. Now would be the time that Cornelius found if he had picked the correct man to help run his most profitable rail line. Billy Vanderbilt relied on the knowledge passed to him from Daniel Drew and, above all, remained calm despite the media storm brewing from his oversight. The stock of Harlem did fall, but not to the catastrophic $50 a share as predicted. After the stock fell to $70, Billy was able to purchase the shares of stock that did not exist and watched as the stock price returned to where it had been prior to the corruption. Following the correction, Billy was encouraged as the investors returned to Harlem and the stock price rose to $170 in a matter of weeks. Of course, the aldermen were dismayed that their plan had not returned as much money as they originally thought, but Billy refused to allow more corruption within the line, sensing that the board of directors would attempt the same scheme again if the shares of stock were not more profitable. Cornelius began purchasing the stock of the board of directors until he had purchased almost $1 million in stock of his own company. By doing this, Cornelius added to the faith of his investors while proving to his aldermen that corruption within his companies would not be tolerated. As the other connecting lines watched, Cornelius corrected the wrongs of his rail line and began drawing passengers away from the competing lines. Other rail lines were careful about entering conflict with Cornelius, as he seemed to deal with his conflict the same way. By winning any court case and gaining control of the rail line brave enough to challenge him, in 1864, Cornelius began purchasing the connecting lines around him, starting with the Hudson River Railroad. Following a brief court battle, Cornelius bought a controlling interest in the railroad and was soon named president of the Hudson River Railroad. For Cornelius, the success he had once enjoyed on the waters had seemingly transferred flawlessly to the railways. The days of Cornelius owning the monopoly of the rails were only months away. In 1867, Cornelius purchased a controlling interest in the New York Central Railroad, which granted Cornelius a monopoly on the railroads of New York and much of the East Coast. 2 years later, Cornelius would purchase the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway. The acquisition of the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway ensured that Cornelius could connect his railroads and form more seamless traffic for his passengers from rail line to rail line. In 1870, Cornelius recognized the need to begin consolidating his railroads, so he began with his current leader of railroad profit, the Hudson River Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, forming the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. Upon completion of the consolidation, the railroad became the first corporation of its magnitude in American history. To this point, Cornelius had been primarily concerned with the safety and speed of his trains. However, as American passengers began to pay more attention to detail, Cornelius recognized that he would need to begin allocating more funds to the train station and commodities on the trains themselves. To begin this project, Cornelius led his son in a renovation of the Harlem train station, demolishing the current station for a more gaudy and larger station named the Grand Central Depot, located on 42nd Street in Lower Manhattan. Upon completion in 1871, Cornelius had created a terminal that could house the majority of his train lines that served New York. While the terminal would be replaced after Cornelius's death, many considered the train depot to be both the best-looking and best-serving train depot in America at the time. In the early days of Cornelius Vanderbilt's life, many recall the rivalry turned partnership that Cornelius held with Daniel Drew. Though the two had reconciled their differences to the extent that Cornelius trusted Drew with his wayward son, the relationship between the two fell upon hard grounds again in 1868. Drew had recently been named the treasurer of the Erie Railway, and some of his transactions were perceived as dishonest by Cornelius. To enact his revenge against his former partner, Cornelius began a mission to corner the stock on the Erie Railway. The ensuing battle between Drew and Cornelius became known as the Erie War, a legendary battle held in high regards by those in the railway industry. Recognizing his futility against the genius and financial backing of Cornelius, Drew recruited Jay Gould, a genius in the development of railroads, and James Fisk Jr., a millionaire who offered Drew the financial stability he would need to ward off the potential takeover from Cornelius. To vanquish the corner on their stock, the trio of men began offering watered stock to Cornelius. Watered stock is stock that has been artificially inflated, thus lowering the amount of stock a company can offer. The plan faced fierce legal troubles, but Gould was able to use financial leverage via a bribe to the state legislature that legalized the artificial stock. Immediately, Cornelius began losing money from the artificial stock and recognized that he had been deceived. Cornelius was able to mend the injustice and recover the money he had lost through a lawsuit, but the culmination of the attempted takeover was a bitter rivalry between Gould and Cornelius. Following the trial, Cornelius and Gould's bitter relationship was leaked to the public, and Gould became a thorn in the side of Cornelius. Often, when the two were public, Cornelius would publicly belittle Gould, much against his usual quiet nature. The usual Cornelius would become good friends and allies with others after lawsuits and public disagreements. The fight with Gould had publicly embarrassed Cornelius, however, and for that, he would never forgive Gould. The true genius of Cornelius was found in his financial management. Cornelius hated to leave money simply residing in an expense account. In a novel on the life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, Rodney Obhebtion notes that Cornelius had a 5-step plan to diversify his wealth. First, buy your railroad. Second, stop the stealing that was going on under the former management. Third, improve it in every practicable way within a reasonable expenditure. Fourth, consolidate it with any other road with which it can be run economically. Fifth, make it pay dividends. Additionally, if Cornelius ever noticed that one of his train stations was doing poorly, he would consolidate the wealth and profits of the struggling train station with another station that was doing much better. By doing such, Cornelius watched time and time again as the struggling station would eventually come out of its recession and perform more successfully. However, if one were to ask Cornelius the key to his success, he would never divulge the methods to his madness. One reporter did have the nerve to ask such a question, to which Cornelius replied, "I pay for what I buy and only sell what I've got. I never tell anybody what I am going to do until I have done it." Cornelius truly operated strictly on personal feelings that were rooted in his genius. As the richest man in America at the time of his death, one would be foolish to doubt the intuition and genius of such a wealthy man. Cornelius's daily schedule was a bit of an oddity to those who worked around him. Despite healthy habits that included rising early in the morning, Cornelius would not enter his office until the late morning, often after 11 o'clock. For the next 2 hours, Cornelius would tend to the various transactions of the day and would do so with only the help of one clerk. Cornelius also did not trust the bookkeepers, leading to keeping the entirety of his financial dealings in a small notebook kept on his person at all times. Perhaps the result of his limited education, Cornelius hated writing letters. Whenever he needed to compose a letter, he would simply dictate his message, usually short and concise, to his clerk. He also hated reading letters or messages. Often, if the message contained more than 10 lines of writing, Cornelius would give the message to his clerk and command him, "Here, see what this man is driving at, and tell me the gist of it." Cornelius was truly an impatient man who only exhibited patience in watching the stock market. In 1868, Cornelius endured the tragic loss of his wife. However, Cornelius, as a man who rarely took time to reflect on life and events, moved on quickly from the loss of his love and married his cousin, Frank Crawford, a woman, only 1 year later. While Cornelius was saddened by the loss of his first wife, it was his second wife who would have the greatest impact on his life. Cornelius's second wife, Frank, would open a new chapter in Cornelius's life, the chapter of philanthropy. Until the death of his first wife, Cornelius had held very little respect for the philanthropic efforts of his day. Most Americans were living meager lifestyles, and the ones who were enjoying lucrative lives were entitled to keep their money to themselves. However, Cornelius's second wife was a woman given to compassion. Of particular interest to Frank was the education of children in America, education that lasted beyond a high school degree. Frank compelled her husband to donate to cousin Holland Nimmons McTire, who was working on founding a college in Nashville, Tennessee. Cornelius had more wealth than he needed, and sensing that his life was nearing its end, made a $1 million donation to McTire for educational outreach. Cornelius's donation proved to be the largest donation towards the college, and to honor the new philanthropist, McTire named the college after Cornelius, and thus Vanderbilt University was born. The $1 million donation was also notably the largest philanthropic donation in America at the time. Following his donation to the McTire, Cornelius donated $50,000 to purchase a church that Frank wanted for her congregation. Though the amounts were never disclosed, Cornelius donated to most of the churches in the surrounding New York area. For his own church, the Moravian Church he had helped found so many years earlier, Cornelius donated 8.5 acres so that the church could have the traditional cemetery so many churches had at the time. A man of money, Cornelius soon found the honor in sharing his wealth with others, and by doing so left the greatest part of his legacy simply through giving. On January the 4th, 1877, Cornelius passed away after being limited to his room due to chronic illnesses for the past 8 months. Upon his death, doctors agreed that exhaustion was the cause of death, the cruel result of a man who had not known the leisurely life like so many with his wealth. Cornelius had lived a full life, however. At 82 years old, Cornelius had given this world everything he had and continued to touch lives after his death through his philanthropic efforts. Valued at over $100 million when he died, Cornelius gave up his title as the richest living man in history, a title immediately bestowed upon his son, William Cornelius Vanderbilt, the vice president of his famous Harlem Railroad line. Upon his death, Cornelius's will was read, bestowing 93% of his wealth to his son William alone. The rest was divided among his other sons and second wife, Frank. Sadly, one son received substantially less than his family members. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt was the scourge of the family, taking Billy's place after Billy became so financially savvy. As a lasting testament to his disdain for his son, Cornelius left his son only the meager earnings from a $200,000 trust fund that never fully developed. Following his death, Cornelius was buried in the Moravian cemetery he had donated to his church in the last years of his life. In a recent study, it was found that Cornelius would have been worth $143 billion in 2007 if he were alive today. Such wealth is rare, but even rarer among men who lived as modest of a life as Cornelius did. When asked if he ever would spend a lot of money on a certain element of life, his family noted that the only item Cornelius would spend an exorbitant amount of money on was racehorses. Cornelius was given a capstone to his legacy in 1999 when he was inducted into the North American Railway Hall of Fame. The very man who had built the railroad system of America now rested among his brethren. Cornelius Vanderbilt lived a full life that serves as a testament to those seeking a career in manual labor. Though Cornelius's life seemed destined for hardship when he dropped out of school at the age of 11, Cornelius failed to let a lack of education stand in the way of success. Cornelius learned his trade from working as hard as he could and not being afraid to risk some wealth for the promises of greater reward. Through courage demonstrated in his various financial transactions, Cornelius rose to a level of wealth America had never seen. In his own words, "If a fellow's got guts, he can always win." Cornelius certainly possessed the guts necessary to separate himself from his peers. When a 15-year-old Cornelius remarked, "I'm tired of working for somebody else," he laid the foundation for independence in his life, an independence that would allow him to be his own boss from the time he was 35 until his death. Cornelius Vanderbilt will live on through his legacy that compels men to rely on their hard work more than their education in the pursuit of success in today's world.